Um, I declare open this public hearing for the Joint Standing Committee on the National Broadband Network. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians. On behalf of the committee, I welcome everybody to today's hearing. We're joined by Ms. Templeman. I don't think we have Ms. Allen at this stage. Senator Antic, Senator Davey, Senator Farrell is not with us at this stage. Senator Griff is.
I am with you.
Thank you, Senator Farrell. My apologies. Dr. Haynes is with us. Mr. Mitchell is with us. Mrs. Phillips is with us. Do we have Senator Sheldon and Mr. Watts?
You've got me, Tony.
So Senator Sheldon was an apology and Mr. Watts was there.
No, I've just heard
good,
him.
now I can see you.
So the only person on the list of anticipated colleagues is Dr. Allen, who is yet to join us unless I've made a mistake. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of the proceeding is being made. The hearing is also being broadcast via the Australian Parliament House website. I remind witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of giving evidence to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also in contempt to give false or misleading evidence to the committee. The committee generally prefers evidence to be given in public, but under the Senate's resolutions, witnesses have the right to request to be heard in private session. If a witness objects to hearing a question, to answering a question, the witness should state the ground upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request to be given may request that the answer be given in camera. Such a request may, of course, also be made at any other time. A witness called to answer a question for the first time should state their full name and the capacity in which they appear, and witnesses should speak clearly to assist Hansard to record proceedings. I also remind committee members that the Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given a reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Officers are also reminded that any claim that it would be contrary to the public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and should be accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. I ask that all microphones be kept on mute when you are not speaking, and to ensure that mobile phones are turned off for the duration or alternatively switched to silent. To assist Hansard, I remind all speakers to state their name prior to speaking. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the formalities over. I welcome representatives of the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications. I thank them for taking the time to give evidence today. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. Then, can I ask for the Hansard record for each of you to please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thank you, Chair. Richard Windier, Deputy Secretary, Communications and Media Group, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications.
Tristan Cathage, Assistant Secretary, Telecommunications Market Policy Branch, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications.
Andrew Madsen, I'm currently the Acting First Assistant Secretary of the Communications Infrastructure Division at the same department.
I'm Nicole Power, Acting Assistant Secretary of the NBN branch in the same department.
Thank you for that. I now invite you to make a short opening statement. At the conclusion of your remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have any opening remarks to make. Happy to proceed straight to questions.
Okay, so before we get to that, colleagues, I just want to remind ourselves via Madam Secretariat of how we've determined to proceed. We've got the department for effectively an hour and a half, so 30 minutes assigned. Welcome, Dr. Allen. Just finishing the formalities. We've got 30 minutes effectively each, unless that's exhausted, and then we'll divide it up equally. So, Susan, that's your recollection of the way we're going to proceed?
Yes, it is.
All right. Well, Susan, I'll hand over to you to begin, and you'll operate as controller for the first half an hour. Is that okay?
Well, look, I'm happy to hand over to the independents to start with, especially while all the technology is working beautifully.
Okay, that's all right. Well, I can't recall who we suggested would convene that, but I think it might be Dr. Haynes. Is that okay, Doctor?
Or Senator Griff.
Senator Griff, I don't mind. Who between the two of you, you'll work it out.
Senator Griff's going to kick off, and then I'll follow.
Right. Okay.
Off you go.
Good. Fantastic. Look, perhaps I'm not sure whether I imagine, Mr. Windia, this would be a question to you. I mean, given that NBN has already reached its build milestone, what work needs to be done by NBN, or particularly the department, before the minister can officially declare the build is complete? I mean, is the work underway, and also when will it likely be completed?
Thank you, Senator. So I think the work is absolutely underway to work out in terms of a process, establishing a process by which the minister will be able to consider that question of whether the network is complete and fully operational, which is, as you know, one of the requirements or points set out in the legislation. So yes, that work is underway to prepare the process by which the minister will undertake that, form that view. As to the timing of when that would occur, that is a matter which is still to be determined, and ultimately will be a matter for the minister. I might hand over to Mr. Madsen, who can probably offer you a couple more remarks just to flesh out how we think that process, at least a high level at this stage, might occur.
Thank you, Richard. Perhaps just to unpack that a little bit, and perhaps for the benefit of the committee, the NBN Companies Act sets out a process through which the Communications Minister would declare the network built and fully operational, and that's the first of a series of steps set out in the NBN Companies Act that must be undertaken before any government could consider commencing a privatisation process. And so the first of those steps is for the Communications Minister to form a view as to whether the network's been built and whether it's fully operational. And Minister Fletcher has made some public statements as to his intended approach to that, where he's acknowledged that he will undertake an assessment process based on receipt of submissions from NBN Co, and that he will seek advice from the department and potentially some technical experts to evaluate that information from the company, and that will form the basis, or a portion of the basis, for his assessment as to whether the network is indeed built and fully operational. Does
the department anticipate a new regulatory framework being required before NBN is privatised?
Senator, I think that's sort of asking us to sort of cast a view on what might happen at some point in the future. So I think there is, it is open to changes to a regulatory framework in that context, but no specific contemplation around that has been given at the moment, in part because there's no specific contemplation being given to the question of privatisation.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Has the department produced any research, or do you have any views regarding the future competitiveness of the telecommunication sector? In particular, are regional and rural areas likely to experience more or less competition over the next 3 to 5 years? I'm
not sure I can point to a research sort of forecasts of likely competition in particular parts of the market. I think there's a pretty consistent series of work done by the ACCC reporting on the state of competition in the telecommunications market in Australia. What I don't have is any particular forecast view of how competition is likely to evolve into the future, including in regional and rural Australia. What we would say, I think, based on what we've seen, is that there are good indications that over recent years there's been a reasonably constant decrease in real terms in terms of prices for broadband or telecommunication services broadly. And there's also been a healthy number of people, RSPs, offering services on the back of the NBN. So I think, putting those two things together, it would look like there is there is a healthy degree of competition working across the Australian telecommunications landscape at the moment.
Okay, fair enough. Once the NBN is complete, the statement of expectations will obviously need to be revised. Has your department undertaken any work on what a revised SOE could include?
We've certainly been thinking about that, Senator, because, as you point out, because the timing, there will need to be a revision to that statement of expectations at some point in time. So yes, we have been giving some thought about to what that might look like, but we obviously are still working through issues, as your sort of opening question suggested, around forming the view around whether we've reached completion of the network build. So, we haven't sort of settled on what a new statement of expectations might look like, and it'll be thought about sort of in the context of trying to understand or form the view about completion of the build phase of the project.
Okay. Look, I'd like to now just ask some questions regarding issues that a number of suburban households in particular have been pushed onto satellite connections, seemingly to reduce the workload or costs associated with establishing fixed line connections. How does your department monitor that NBN is making appropriate connection decisions, and has any action been taken to curtail or pull back this particular behaviour?
So we work or monitor very closely decisions NBN takes around how it plans to roll out the network. At the end of the day, those technical planning decisions and network choice decisions are decisions made and appropriately made by the company rather than by us. So we understand that, and there are inevitably in a rollout of this nature, there are choices that have to be made. So we are very conscious of those. We do seek to understand how NBN is arriving at those conclusions, but the decisions ultimately end up being decisions made by the sort of technical and planning experts inside the company. I don't know whether Mr. Madsen's got anything.
Well, perhaps just where we do become aware of instances that might give rise to some questions about how NBN has selected a particular technology, I think we would typically look at that first of all based on information that the department holds about the network rollout in those areas, what public information there may be, and then we would make inquiries of NBN Co as to what factors may have influenced its choices in particular areas. And in many instances there are multiple factors that the company is weighing up in making a technology choice decision. That often relate to the state of the existing infrastructure in a particular area, from the range of different technologies that NBN has available that it can deploy, which of those technologies may be suitable, and what difference various choices of technology may make in terms of the time frame to deploy the infrastructure, the cost of deploying the infrastructure, and the overall service quality that technology will provide.
Are there have you had any discussions with NBN in relation to retrospectively connecting satellite customers to fixed line or fixed wireless services?
Senator, I think we have, because I think there have been. Look, over the course of some years, we probably have, at a variety of points, had discussions around that. I mean, I don't know that there are specific discussions going to specific locations that we've had that conversation in.
Relatively recently, NBN has made some decisions, particularly around a number of fixed wireless locations where it was having difficulty securing an appropriate site to place its tower. And so it may have been over for a number of years looking to secure land access and go through relevant approval processes to find suitable tower locations that would provide an effective and efficient coverage for a particular region. So in a number of areas, it announced in June of this year that because of those difficulties, it was making a decision to change technology, and as a result, some of those premises that no longer could be served effectively through the fixed wireless technology were converted to a fixed line technology, and some other premises were converted to be served by the satellite technology.
Right, thank you, Chair. Over to Dr. Haynes.
Thanks, Mr. Griff.
Thanks, Senator Griff, and good morning, everyone. And thank you to our witnesses this morning. I'd like to turn our attention to the impact of COVID-19 on the usage of NBN, and I'm particularly interested, of course, in data consumption needs and how they've increased with the rise in remote work. I'm wondering what you can tell me about the nature of the demand rise in regional Australia. I'm curious to know how the department has worked with NBN Co to ensure that demand was met.
Thank you. And look, I'll pass to some of my colleagues to give you some detail, because certainly there was a very, I think, a good story all round in terms of the way Australia's telecommunications networks held up in the face of demand that was perhaps not quite foreseen, and it had a number of, it caused a number of pressures. There were pressures in terms of just total number of data in the network. There were significant increases in the time of day at which there was increased consumption of data, and there was also significant increases in the level of or consumption of, well, not so much consumption, but the use of the upstream capacity, all as a consequence of people's changed behaviours, both working from home, increased use of telehealth, and of course having students all studying from home. We monitored that very closely with in conjunction with NBN and conjunction with the industry more broadly, and there were a number of steps taken quite early by the Minister to help set up a mechanism within the telecommunications industry to make sure that they were able to respond appropriately and quickly to any capacity challenges that emerged. But I might hand over to Mr. Cathedge to give you some more detail on exactly what the pressures will look like and some of the steps that were taken.
I might just start with remarking on some of the levels of data that have been downloaded and uploaded. And I would note that NBN Co is publishing weekly updates on its website comparing pre-COVID-19 periods to the present period. It is fair to say that compared to pre-COVID-19 levels, there are significant new peak levels of network traffic. And the highest level of traffic observed on the network was on during the busy time of 14.5 terabits per second, 32% increase over pre-COVID-19 records. And the largest proportional increase of network traffic occurred in the working day on May 1, 2020 at 11 a.m, where download traffic was 7 terabits, which was 67% higher than pre-COVID-19 levels. Also, interestingly, upload traffic was much higher at 0.92 terabits, which was a 129% increase to pre-COVID-19 levels. I might just also remark that we've also been working very closely with the mobile providers in terms of their networks, and they have also observed substantial levels of increase on their networks, with Comms Alliance, or Communications Alliance, the peak body, reporting that 40% increase in traffic. Just in terms of Mr Windia's comment in relation to work that we've been doing with the carriers, as Mr Windia noted, Minister Fletcher convened a roundtable earlier this year to gather the industry together to talk about how, as an industry, we were going to deal with COVID-19. A key outcome of that was the establishment of a special working group. So that was a special working group between NBN Co and its retailers, and that met relatively frequently, and still does, to talk about how the network can cope with increases in traffic, including working with over-the-top providers, video game companies, and so on and so forth to manage the traffic.
Thanks, Mr Carthage. Are you able to comment about the level of demand in regional Australia? Have you got some comparisons between regions and metro?
Unfortunately, I don't have that information with me today. It may be something that we can ask NBN Co to provide.
Thank you. I'm curious also about your reflections around whether this demand that we've experienced during, well, ongoing COVID-19 situation, whether it can be sustained. And I'm particularly interested, given the desires that we have as a nation around in moving people into working in the regions, and whether, in fact, this level could work as an indicator that remote working and access to highly functional, fast internet speeds is an indicator that this can continue. Are you able to comment on that?
So I think the question, I suppose, that we're all waiting to see the answer to is how much of what we've seen during these last few months of COVID actually does endure. And obviously some of the pressures associated, for example, with people doing schooling from home are going to come off. But I suspect, or I think there's no reason to believe that people will necessarily stop taking telehealth consultations. And I think there is quite a good prospect that in where possible, and it obviously doesn't apply to all job types, but there will be an increase in people's ability to and interest in being able to work remotely. And I think your point is one that we would probably agree with, that the way the network has held up, and I'd point out that it's something like 87% or 80+% of regional Australia is connected to the fixed line network, and then there is also the fixed wireless and satellite networks. But I think we have demonstrated that the networks in Australia are capable of coping with a very significant increase in overall capacity and in the type of and shape of use of that of the network, and therefore it has demonstrated that remote work is a possibility. Now, I think how that plays out across the Australian economy, in a sense, depends on factors that are unrelated to telecommunications. But yeah, I think our view would be we've seen and are quite pleased to see that the networks are capable of supporting people choosing to work remotely and as COVID's shown, in significant numbers.
Thank you. Just wanting to move the attention to ready to connect areas, and wondering if you've observed, again in this recent period, but leading before that as well, any difference in NBN take-up between metro and regional in terms of ready to connect?
So there are differences in take-up rates between I don't have it broken down by regional and metro as such. We've probably got it broken down by fixed line versus fixed wireless and satellite. And as I said before, it is worth keeping in mind that the vast majority of what's considered to be regional Australia is covered by the fixed line network. But the take-up rates on fixed line are different to the take-up rates on satellite and fixed wireless. Take-up rates have remained... Take-up rates across fixed line, I don't think we've seen over the last 3 months anything that markedly moves the dial on the overall level of take-up. But I think we might have seen early on in COVID an acceleration in the speed with which people were taking up. So there were signs early on in COVID when people began to realise they were going to be relying on telecommunication services to increase, to hurriedly seek to order an NBN-based service. So there was, as I say, an acceleration in take-up. In terms of the difference between fixed line and fixed wireless and satellite, broadly speaking, I think the fixed line take-up rate is somewhere around 72-73%, whereas the take-up rate across the other two technologies is probably closer to 50% overall. Perhaps I forget how it's lower on satellite than it is on fixed wireless. One of the reasons for that, of course, is that we have currently got in place a requirement that those areas continue to have a choice of technology. So as you would know, in the fixed line footprint, there is a period where you've got the opportunity to connect to the NBN before the old Telstra network is switched off. So there's a required migration to either onto the NBN or off onto a completely different network. Whereas in the fixed wireless and satellite areas, there continues to be the ability to stay on the Telstra network and continue to get ADSL services if you wish them. And so I think that is part of the reason why the take-up rate in those technology areas is less, because a bunch of people are not being forced to make a decision to change. So they have, if they're happy with their ADSL service, they've continued to stick with it. I think I might see. I'm not sure whether any of my colleagues have any particular numbers, but I might flick to Mr. Madsen, who looks like he might be able to give you a couple of numbers about those take-up rates.
Thank you. Perhaps just in the time that you've afforded me, I've been able to find some of that data. So Mr. Windier, I think, has very accurately described those figures. Perhaps the one that I'll just give a bit more detail on is the take-up rates between fixed wireless and satellite services. And so the fixed wireless service take-up rate has stayed around 50%. And the satellite take-up rate is sort of closer to 20 to 25%. And perhaps just a couple of extra observations. I think partly as a result of the coordinated activity that's occurred across the industry, I suppose we've been very pleased to see that despite disruption to workforces and having to adjust working practices to accommodate health challenges, the industry has continued to be able to supply new services, and the NBN company has been able to continue making premises ready to connect at very high volumes, to the point where it's achieved its rollout targets for this financial year well ahead of the end of the financial year. So it's been pleasing to see how the industry has responded and continued to make services available in terms of new connections, and to make sure that services where there might have been any disruptions have been managed effectively. And so, for example, one thing that NBN has done through that time period has tried to reduce the number of perhaps non-critical system upgrades that were occurring. So there were fewer disruptions that may have normally occurred to the service as a result of technical changes to the network, in order to maintain high quality, reliable services through that period. While the take-up rate has continued pretty much as forecast, we have seen that within some households have chosen to upgrade the service that they may have been ordering. So they may have moved from a plan that had a maximum speed of 25 megabits per second up to a 50 megabits per second plan, or from a 50 megabits per second plan up to 100 megabits per second plan, perhaps partly because they've seen the extra reliance that the household has on their broadband service. I think the data that we've seen in terms of the consistent performance of the network doesn't suggest that that change has been driven by any underlying issues that households may have had. It's perhaps more a sense of them wanting to have an extra level of assurance that the service was going to meet what they saw as an expanding use of their broadband service. And probably just lastly, I think one area where we did see some extra take-up was around the satellite service. And so there was an extra level of take-up of the NBN's satellite service, as some of those households, as Richard mentioned, they're not required to move on to the NBN, but they may have then, I suppose the advent of the COVID pandemic has triggered them to reconsider that and to make that decision to move on to the NBN satellite service where they were in a satellite area.
Thank you very much.
Chair, could I just ask that we get a firm commitment to get that regional city data? I think, Mr Carthage, you mentioned there were a couple of questions that mentioned it. Would it be possible?
Happy to try and see what we can get to split it by regional and metro as opposed to by technology type for you.
Yeah, and it was mentioned in two separate questions, so that would be very good to
we'll
see.
we'll take that on notice, certainly.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thanks very much, Deputy Chair.
Might be a good opportunity to segue to you, Ms Templeman, and you can guide us for the next half an hour.
Thank you. All right. I just want to drill down into fibre to the node. In a bit over a year ago, in April 2019, NBN Co revealed that 183,000 fibre to the node users couldn't achieve minimum speeds of 25 megabits a second. And some of those were due to coexistence, some were degraded copper lines or long loop lengths. Sometimes there was internal cabling causing interference. I just want to know what information and updates has the department sought and received on this problem?
Senator, I'll turn to my colleagues to
I'm
see
just
whether...
an MP.
Oh, sorry. My apologies.
It's a promotion.
I'll turn to my colleagues to see whether what we've got in terms of data for you in terms of the breakup. As a general observation, though, I would say that yes, we have quite a lot of discussions with NBN to understand how those various components are affecting performance. It's certainly the case that things like people's in-home wiring arrangements and even sometimes the equipment they've got attached to the network have a significant impact on the type of speeds people are experiencing. And that is something that NBN has been working on, and I think it's something that the retailers themselves are also conscious of and try and work on. Coexistence is as you know, a particular issue which is being progressively addressed as an exchange area becomes...
and I guess the bit I'm interested in is what information and updates you've received on the progress of that.
So I don't know whether we've got before us... We can certainly get on notice the latest situation around where coexistence is at. I don't know whether anyone at the table has any data right here. But we can take on notice and come back to you on what we know about the split of those degraded copper
issues, the degraded copper, the long loops, and then
coexistence. Happy to do that.
Thank you. So, how many fibre to the node lines are currently unable to achieve a layer 2 speed of 25 megabits per second?
I'm not sure we've got the figure in front of us, so we can take that. We're very happy to take that on notice and find out.
Do you have any idea about it?
I'm not sure that... look, you've quoted the figure from April 2019. I don't know that we've got any... We don't have anything before us now, which is an update on that. But we're very happy to find the latest number that we've got, and if we can find it if we can find it quickly, we're happy to provide it to you.
Even if you can tell us, is it above or below 183,000? Is there a figure?
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to speculate because obviously there is work going on to reduce that number all the time, but there is also increasing number of customers coming online. So let us see what information we can find to give you the latest situation on that.
So on the long copper loops, we've talked about people being switched to satellite. Are you aware whether any of the services on long copper loops were some of those switched to satellite?
The most recent the switches to satellite were mostly that have been talked about recently, largely for the reasons Mr. Madsen talked about, which were actually mostly instances where fixed wireless was unable to be installed, and it was then a question of what is the most efficient alternative technology to move them to. And as Mr. Madsen said, some were moved onto fixed line. I would suspect that some of those were moved onto a fibre to the node fixed line, but some of them may well have been moved onto a different type of fixed line technology, and some were moved onto satellite. But that was largely because of difficulties in getting access to sites for installing fixed wireless.
So can I just be clear, if a bit over a year ago there were 183,000, do we think there are who couldn't get the 25 megabits? Do we believe, have you been monitoring, do you believe there are fewer of that number now? Or is that number static?
Our expectation would be that number is coming down. I suppose
How are you monitoring that against the statement of expectations?
We monitor the migration process. As an area is made ready to connect, there's then an 18-month period through which the household moves on to the NBN. While that's a required transition in fixed line areas, they do have that 18-month period within which to make that decision. And it's not until all of those households have migrated off the previous copper technology onto NBN's network that what's called the coexistence period can end. And while Telstra's old copper network and the NBN network need to operate in parallel, NBN slightly reduces the power that it transmits signals over its network. And so for many of those households, once the coexistence period ends and Telstra's copper network can be turned off, the process of NBN increasing the power at which its network is operating will lift those households from being slightly under 25 megabits per second in terms of peak speed up to achieving the peak speed. And so it's that sort of, we monitor the migration process and the rate at which premises are reaching the end of the migration period and the point at which coexistence is coming to an end to keep track of how we would expect those that number of households that aren't currently achieving the minimum peak speed to change in their performance.
So in terms of the fibre to the node users on copper lines who can't achieve the 25 megabits, what solutions is NBN deploying, and what are you aware that they've been doing so far to address it?
There are a number of streams because, as you point out, there is that category that Mr. Madsen's just taken us through with respect to coexistence. So that is coming. That is reducing constantly as exchange areas and the migration period works through the system. And as Mr. Madsen says, we monitor very closely the progress of areas becoming ready to connect, and then the 18-month period during which migration occurs, and then the progress of areas out of the migration period. NBN has an active program of, working on the network, and where it experiences difficulties with the quality of the network, it's got an active program to, repair and maintain and the network, and that much of that they can do without that being a customer triggering a fault. So they are in the field maintaining their network constantly, which will address issues associated with poorly performing parts of the network or damaged parts of the network. And then the other category where there is NBN is doing quite a lot of work to try and help inform customers and inform RSPs to inform their customers does go to where there's a concern that internal home wiring is the cause of the degradation, and including some work NBN did some time ago to help RSPs understand which modems that were being deployed are potentially having an impact on the experience that the customers getting.
So your monitoring of it sounds like it comes in at different stages rather than an ongoing monitoring. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's right. So we monitor sort of different bits in different ways because they're sort of different processes.
So when the coexistence phase comes to an end and a fibre to the node customer still can't get 25 megabits per second, what happens then?
So in the first instance, that would be, in a sense, that's the sort of thing NBN is then looking at in terms of understanding. It knows what it's trying to deliver to customers, and then so it will then look at what it can do or what the issues might be in the network, whether they're things that it needs to improve or repair in terms of its side of the part of the network, as it were. Or it may be that the issues then that become apparent are in-home issues, which are then about customers being informed and deciding to take steps to either improve or change their internal cabling arrangements and or change customer premises equipment if the equipment's the problem.
And do you have that number? How many where coexistence has ended? Have you got a breakdown of the numbers of each of those?
Yes, we would have. Sorry, we wouldn't have it here with us today.
But if we could have those.
Yes, but we do monitor the migration process, and we meet regularly with NBN and with Telstra, who is of course the other major party in that process, to monitor progress and over the years to have worked through issues that have been a factor in migration. Things like connection of lifts and premises with home alarms and so forth. There've been a suite of issues that have been addressed as part of managing that migration process.
So just finally,
I was going to say we're happy to see what we can provide to you on notice in terms of the data we've got about the transition from through the migration period and what the story looks like on the other side.
And my last question is, how long will it take from what you know, for all fibre to the node users to have a minimum speed of 25 megabits per second?
Well, I think the first part of that is when the last period of coexistence is going to end up being 18 months after the last area of fibre to the node is released into the market. So that we must be close to that. They may well be very close to having released the last of the fibre to the node areas, but we can confirm that for you. So there's in a sense an 18-month lag, and it's whenever the last area comes on.
And you expect them at the end of that 18-month lag for everybody to have 25 megabits.
That's when the coexistence issue should disappear, and then the expectation is the network is able to deliver 25 megabits per second, and then obviously there is the question of what work does the company need to continue to do on its network to make sure it can meet that speed, and or what consumers may need to do in terms of their side of the network that is affecting their experience.
So it realistically, you won't expect it to happen before 2022.
For some areas of the network, because that's the thing that we can try and get you some information on. Yeah. The 18-month period is obviously a rolling 18 months in different areas, so we've got quite a lot of experience of areas that have gone through that period now, and we will know, therefore we can see what we can provide you in terms of what the story looked like after the end of the migration period. But yes, so the last area is 18 months from whenever it came to market.
Now I'm going to ask Mr. Mitchell to take over.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance. On the 1st of April, Labor called for a rebate system and to not have an internet home to connect to the NBN. For all the devastation that COVID has caused, it's created a unique opportunity for state education systems to identify digitally excluded families and then work with industry and the federal government to help get them online.
Mr. Mitchell, I'm wondering if others are having difficulty hearing you as well. I certainly am.
So that would be a rarity, Chair, a rarity. Is that coming through? Is that better?
That is better.
it is better.
That's better. Perhaps if you could start the question again. Sorry, Mr. Mitchell.
All right. On the 1st of April, Labor called for a rebate to assist families who do not have any internet at home connect to the NBN. For all the devastation that COVID has caused, it has created a unique opportunity for state education systems to identify digitally excluded families and then work with industry and the federal government to help get them online. So I want to start out by acknowledging the efforts of Telstra, NBN Co and Optus on this issue, and also acknowledge the efforts of Vodafone. It's important to do that. But in terms of the NBN initiative that was subsequently announced on 17th of April, what role has the department had in overseeing this?
Thank you for that question. We obviously were kept closely informed about the initiatives that NBN was developing. It wasn't an initiative that was in any way regulatorily required. It was an initiative developed by the company in response to an obvious, a unique set of circumstances and a need for connectivity, and done in conjunction with the retailers. In a sense, the cooperation around developing that was more between the retailers, who obviously have to have the relationship with the customer, between the retailers and NBN than between ourselves and the NBN. But we were kept closely informed through the process as NBN was developing a possible product and consulting its retailers on how it might work.
So it was more of a hands-off, just sort of keeping an eye on it. Is that be fair?
I think that's right. I mean, what was important, what we were interested in, is to make sure that what NBN is noting the way the market works, and NBN's only in the wholesale territory, and then retailers have their own ways of dealing with their customers. We were certainly very interested to make sure that any product that NBN designed, or offering NBN designed, was one that was practical and able to be practical and attractive to RSPs to sign on to, so that there was some prospect that RSPs would look to put it out into the market. Our interest was making sure what the industry was developing with a lot of goodwill and good faith was ended up being practical and therefore potentially useful.
On that note, is the data being centrally collected based on the feedback from respective states to scope the number of families who are identified as having no internet at home?
Not by us, it isn't, but it may well be that there is some data that NBN or the RSPs have around who they think is in scope or who has expressed interest in taking up.
Are you able to get that data on notice for the committee?
We can see what we can get. Yes.
All right, thank you. What has the department learned so far about why the identified families do not have internet? What are the primary barriers, and how does device availability fit into the picture?
Perhaps if I could respond to that. In the work that we have been doing, we have looked to coordinate activity across the industry through the reference group, but also, I suppose, through the COVID, the government's response to the COVID pandemic. There have been a number of discussions going on across government. So we have been liaising with health and education departments to understand how households and businesses and education and health facilities have been reliant on communication services. And through those processes, we have both, I suppose, passed on that information to the industry participants, and we've also passed on information to state and territory governments, both health and education areas, as to the relief packages that were being developed and provided by NBN Co and the individual retail service providers, so that state and territory governments could take that into account as they were considering support measures that were being put in place for schools or for families who were in financial difficulty and or may not have had an adequate internet connection.
Just on that, you mentioned the families with financial difficulty. How many low-income families without internet at home have been connected as a result of the NBN wholesale rebate?
We don't have specific numbers, but again, we have been continuing to monitor that process by regular discussion with communications industry through discussions with peak bodies in the industry and with NBN Co and through those connections back to state and territory governments. So the feedback that we're receiving is that there is a good level of awareness of the programs that have been put in place by the telecommunications industry and that the telecommunications industry is indicating that they believe they're meeting the demand that's occurring in terms of any households that are coming forward with indicating they're looking for support and financial assistance or bill relief and other measures.
So you mentioned you don't have, sorry, I can see you're finding it hard to hear me. I'll try and speak up. Do you not collect the data about how many low-income families are receiving the rebate, or is the information available and you just don't have it to hand? Or, I mean, is the data collected? Are you able to get your hands on it?
It's not collected by us because we don't have any direct relationship with the people, with selling and signing on the consumers of the product. It is data that NBN, I am sure, has data about how many services they have sold to RSPs under this particular package, and RSPs would be able to would know who they've signed up to using this package. We can certainly endeavour to get some information from the industry that we could provide on notice, but that's where the information would be held on the specifics.
Thank you. Now, NBN has set a timeline of September 2020 for the duration of the wholesale rebate. Why is it so short? Not far away.
I think, I mean, look, NBN may be able to elaborate on or give you a more detailed explanation of what their thought process was. But I think the thing to keep in mind is it was put in place obviously as an emergency COVID-related measure. It was particularly in an environment where, as we all know, we were in the extraordinary circumstances, suddenly every school child having to learn from home, and therefore even in instances where there may well have been internet connections available within a household, they may perhaps, for example, have been solely data packages based around mobile services, for example, which are not as well designed for the education piece. So I think the timing was in part in response to the emergency situation when people were going to be working, doing their schooling from home, and that is obviously, the end of September was picked as a sort of appropriate point in terms of what we could see in the middle of April.
Thank you. Is the objective to help these families and children connect only over the COVID period? I mean, that seems to be what you're saying, but I just want to get that from you. Or is the objective to get these households connected permanently through a sustainable transitional arrangement, which I would suggest be preferable? I think
there's sort of a couple of parts to an answer to that. I mean, in some respects, this was designed in part to address a potential particular concern that there may be a particular need given the sudden pressures on in the education system of people having to study from home. I mean, in the longer run, of course, it is desirable and something that I think is a broad objective to try and encourage and ensure people across Australia do have access to broadband services, because that is obviously an increasingly important service for how people carry out their lives. From where we would sit as the department, I would distinguish between a particular interest in NBN being the one that gets those customers versus an interest in having those customers connected. So, for example, we would be, from a broader telecommunications policy sort of angle, we are agnostic as to whether a customer ends up taking a service from NBN or decides that their uses they can satisfy their uses of the internet based on a mobile phone package or a package that's supported by an alternative network operator. So so from a broad perspective, we're interested in people having been connected, and there are lots of choices for consumers in the market to get connected. They don't all involve the NBN. From the NBN's perspective, there's obviously an interest in growing their number of customers, and that's in a sense a commercial calculation, a commercial issue for them. So they do have a particular interest in trying to secure these customers. But our interest would be that they be connected, but it doesn't have to be via an NBN connection.
What's going to happen in October? Is a transitional plan being worked on?
Perhaps from our observations, the industry is monitoring how its customers are responding through the COVID process. And I suppose it's perhaps worth noting that industry at the retail level has had in place concession packages to support low-income households. And I suppose there is an expectation that those packages will continue to be available, and that industry participants will look at the lessons they've learnt through the COVID pandemic to consider how suitable those packages are as the unique measures that have been put in place may start to unwind. Certainly, looking at NBN Co itself, it has been consulting for a period of about 12 months on processes to improve take-up of its services, particularly among some households that may not have adopted its services. So low-income households are included in that group. So it has been consulting with community stakeholders as to what sort of barriers may have existed, whether it has been the design of a particular product, whether it's been products that might be suitable for people who are frequently moving residences, or whether it does come down to affordability issues. And they are looking at how to adapt their products and to address those barriers. And I think, like with NBN and the other telecommunications providers, they have an interest in trying to drive that take-up and connect as many of those premises and individuals as possible.
Well, thank you. I seem to have lost video, so I'll leave it there for me. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Deputy Chair.
Thank you. In the couple of minutes we've still got left, I'm going to go to Senator Farrell, who's by phone. Have we got Senator Farrell?
Thank you, Susan. I've got a couple of questions. A couple of people have touched on them before. I'd just like to drill down a little bit further. In a question on notice in November 2019, the NBN advised that roughly 2,200 towers were operational and ready to connect. Are you able to tell us how many towers have been built since then?
I think we don't have that. We wouldn't have that number in front of us as how many towers have been built since a particular. I don't think we would have the change in the number of towers. We can certainly find that. We can certainly get that information from the company and provide it on notice. But I don't. I'm just looking at my colleagues to see if we've got the number built in a period of time, and I don't think we do. I'm sorry. We're very happy to provide that on notice.
No, if you could do that, that would be much appreciated. Now, taking the NBN supplied figures of 2,200 towers and a ready-for-service footprint of 600,000 premises for fixed wireless, it suggests that each fixed wireless tower covers an average of roughly 275 households. Does that seem like a reasonable estimate?
Well, I mean, yes, I suppose, because as you say, that's how the arithmetic comes up with the answer. However, I'd observe would observe that I think if you looked across those towers, there's probably a bit of variety in terms of the sizes of the community that they are serving. I couldn't tell you I couldn't tell you what that variety looks like, but that I can't. Obviously, what you've said is right. I just suspect there is some variability.
Some will be more and some will be less, but that's roughly the average.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I'll take you to the NBN weekly report, which shows that in the period between the 23rd of April and the 28th of May, roughly 20,000 premises were switched from fixed wireless to satellite. Is that your understanding?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And based on the rough figure of 275 households per tower, this would suggest up to 75 towers would have been needed to serve the 20,000 premises that were switched to satellite. Roughly 150 towers would have needed to be served for 40,000 premises that were switched off fixed wireless. Is that your understanding, that sites could not be secured for that 150 fixed wireless towers?
So, as I said before, there is the number of premises that would have been served from a particular site will vary, and the network, in a sense, it's worth keeping in mind that any particular site for fixed wireless then is divided into a number of cells. So, the amount of, in a sense, the amount of capacity put onto a site will depend upon the number of premises in that particular area. As I said, I suspect there is some considerable variability in the around the average in terms of how big the community might have been that was supposed to be served by a tower. It is certainly the case that the reason customers' premises were switched both to fixed line and to satellite was because of difficulties in securing access to appropriate sites for towers. How many sites that was affected, we'd have to talk to the company about, because I don't think we wouldn't want to make an assumption based on just the straight average.
It's perhaps worth observing that
the unavailability would there have been for the switch?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that question, Senator.
What other reason would there be other than the inability to get suitable premises for the switch to satellite?
Well, I think the primary reason why they couldn't be served by fixed wireless was difficulties with a location for the tower.
I understand that, but you seem to suggest there may be other reasons.
Oh, I'm sorry, Senator. No, not that I'm aware of. I think it was really associated with the site. There are a variety of issues associated with a site, both access to land as well as the ability to get things like backhaul and power to it. So there are a range of factors that go into being able to make a fixed wireless location work, but fundamentally it was about difficulties with securing the sites.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, now, colleagues, we're in the last half an hour, and I'm proposing that we move to the coalition questions.
Chair, I just have one more question. Would it be
okay, Mr. Farrell, if you could.
Senator.
Senator, sorry.
Can the department undertake to provide on notice the location for each fixed wireless site that was switched to satellite?
We can certainly see if we can get that information from the company and provide it on notice. Yes, Senator.
Thank you very much for doing that. That's the end of my questions, Chair.
Thank you, Senator. To you, Senator Antic.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I do have a question, and I'm wondering what the data from NBN Co illustrates in terms of consumer confidence with the network throughout the period of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and what trends have been observed in terms of activations and, in fact, in terms of take-up of the higher speed plans themselves?
Thank you. I think the overall experience over the last few months has demonstrated a remarkable degree of, or a very high degree of confidence in the network operated by NBN and the services being provided over the top of it by retail service providers. I will ask my colleagues to run through some information that sort of unpacks just how high the usage level during the period has been. It's certainly, you touched upon a couple of things which the numbers do bear out. We will, and if we've got them for you now, we'll give them to you, but otherwise we could get them on notice. But certainly there has been an increased rate of people looking to connect to the network. So in a sense, the speed with which people are choosing to migrate onto the NBN accelerated at the beginning of the COVID period. There was an increase of people switching onto the NBN. There was an increased take-up of higher speed plans, and there was notable or observable activity in terms of existing customers of NBN services switching themselves to higher speed plans. I think in anticipation of the sort of pressure that their household may put on the network when you had many members of a household at home and many devices on the network for a considerable period of time. But I might just hand over to Mr. Cathage to give us to mention some of the details.
Sure. I might just point to NBN Co's monthly progress report for April, which was released in late May. I think there's some sort of statistics there that might be of interest to the committee. The first one is that 92% of NBN installations were completed right first time, which was compared to 90% in February 2020. 95% of installations completed within a agreed time frame, which was up from 93% in February 2020. 93% of faults were rectified within agreed time frames, compared to 93% in February 2020, and 0.6 faults per 100 completed premises, which has improved from 0.8 faults in February 2020. And just the last point, I think it's worth noting on that report, which is that the average network bandwidth congestion on the fixed line network dropped from 58 minutes in February 2020 to 15 minutes per week in April 2020. The other thing I think it would be just perhaps useful to draw to the committee's attention was a behavioural survey that NBN Co released relatively recently by Venture Insights that showed over late May and June 2020 that 81% of respondents agreed that fast internet had made them more secure about their jobs. 83% agreed that they could not have completed their work without fast internet. Almost half of respondents who had a medical consultation during the last 2 months over the COVID-19 period had a telehealth consultation, and almost half of respondents said that their households have increased their online shopping activities since COVID-19 crisis began.
Excellent. Senator Davey?
Thank you, Chair. I just have a couple of questions, particularly on, you mentioned earlier that take-up of satellite services was around the 20 to 25%. Is that as was expected in regional areas, or did we actually expect a higher take-up of satellite services?
That is in line with the expectations of a take-up rate for the satellite service. As we mentioned earlier, consumers are not forced to take up an NBN service in the non-fixed line areas that are covered by fixed wireless and satellite. And as a result, some of those households and businesses are choosing to stay with their current service provider. As I mentioned earlier, we have seen a slight increase in the take-up of the satellite service as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps as households are reassessing what their needs are and looking for an alternative option. And so the take-up of the satellite service has been increasing at a slightly higher rate over the last several months.
And during the COVID pandemic, we've seen NBN offer increased data loads for people to sort of allow people managing school children and working from home. The question has been put to me, if we can do that during a pandemic, why can't we do it all the time? Has the department, I know it may be a question better for NBN, but has the department thought of that at all?
Senator, yeah, I think yes, we have, and what our response, I suppose. I mean, you're right. NBN will be able to offer views on this as well. But from our perspective, NBN. One of the concerns at the beginning of the COVID crisis was going to be whether there was making sure people had a good broadband experience, and the risk of congestion or a poor customer experience on the network was something that we were very keen to see avoided, and it was also something that the industry itself, NBN and its RSPs, were keen to see avoided. So NBN, I mean that is something that NBN is keen to avoid anyway, and so has had plans for some period of time whereby it continues to adjust its packages, its wholesale products, to ensure that the customer experience that retail service providers offers is a good one, and congestion and problems with congestion do not occur. So I think in some respects what happened during COVID is we saw, this is perhaps a simple way of putting it, but in a way some of the future brought forward. So whilst they had a plan to progressively revisit and adjust their packages, which they had been talking to RSPs about for some time, this was a particular spike in pressure on the network, so they offered the increased bandwidth. I think the company itself and the RSPs are very, very conscious and working quite hard at the moment to make sure that as they adjust out of the emergency response, we don't suddenly find ourselves at a point where consumers have got to go back to a bad experience. And so there is work underway by the company to make sure its plans and packages continue to meet people's needs. So I think it's not so much I suppose I would say it's not a question of whether the emergency bandwidth provision should be maintained into the future. It's more a observation that it's important that NBN continues to make sure its products and packages provide customers with a good experience into the future, and they've got plans to do that.
And just a final question from me, Chair. Given what we've experienced with COVID, you've said that we saw an increased rate of connections during COVID. But what are we observing with the rollout of 5G? I note that there are some retail providers who are now offering 5G packages, mainly in urban areas. I can't get a 5G package, but they're now offering 5G packages that are the same value, same speeds as NBN. And has there been any consideration that going forward, what the mix is going to look like and whether it would actually undermine the value of the NBN over time?
It's a good question. It's one that's been, it's one that the NBN company itself has been conscious of for some time, and I think has made observations about what it sees as the possible threat from 5G to its business in successive corporate plans. I mean, if we step back from the NBN specifically, we would observe it's a good thing overall for the Australian telecommunications market that there are people investing in and providing services over a variety of network types, and it's very encouraging to see that Australia has a very healthy and advanced rollout of 5G, thus far. I think our feeling would be there is absolutely the possibility that 5G services and I mean it doesn't just have to be 5G, but 5G services do provide some competitive pressure to NBN. I think there is a possibility that is a not a permanent thing. It is a period during which people that have rolled out 5G networks are very keen to use the capacity. But in time, if there is a growing use of mobile, use cases for 5G, they will increasingly look to use that 5G network for mobile purposes rather than fixed purposes. And I think we've seen some of the mobile operators in Australia make observations to say that they think in the long run, really, mobile networks are not going to be a substitute for fixed line networks. It may be that everyone's using their 5G telephone to talk to the NBN over Wi-Fi, but moving data onto fixed line is something that I think mobile network operators expect to continue. But the other observation I would make is that the fact that there is 5G out there and they are offering some packages in competition to NBN means it's very important that NBN be allowed to and able to compete in the market. And it is adjusting it has adjusted its prices and products over time to respond to the market. And we've seen their take-up rate remain relatively steady over the last few years. So I think that means they are meeting the competition quite well, and that is something that they would be, they've got good incentives to continue to do.
Thank you.
Excellent. If I could just address a couple of questions. Firstly, the NBN public progress data report indicated that the NBN is now available in more than 11.6 million homes and businesses, and more than 7.2 million have connected. In the department's view, how has the multi-technology mix supported Australians working and studying from home through COVID?
Well, I think the evidence suggests that the network and all its technologies have held up very well. The pressures on the network in terms of data consumption do not distinguish between the type of technology people are on.
Sure.
The very fact that we've seen the network hold up and support the dramatic increases in use that Mr. Cathedge has talked to earlier suggests that all of those technologies in the multi-technology mix have met the challenge put to it during COVID.
And in light of that, would an all-fibre alternative to the rollout have seen more Australians stranded on 8 megabits per second ADSL speeds during COVID?
That's a tricky question for me to answer, to be honest. But what I would say is that what we've seen over the last few months suggests that the technology type has not been a barrier to people being able to get a very good experience during quite extraordinary times in terms of pressure on the network. So clearly the type of technology is not the determinative factor. The other thing, I guess it also proves what we've seen in recent time demonstrates a point that was a conclusion of the Vertigan review some years ago, that in a sense what people were after, or what the Australian sort of consumer needed overall, was to make sure they had high speed services available as quickly as possible. And so I think what we've seen is we've got a network, it does have a variety of technologies in it, and those technologies have seemed to be able to meet the challenge put to them.
Does the department have where it would have been, where the rollout would have been if we had adopted the all-fibre approach at this point? So the question is, do we know, and is the department able to tell us how many homes and businesses would have had internet technology available to them of this type had we pursued the all-fibre alternative to this point?
Look, I'm sorry, I don't have. We're a long time into the multi-technology mixed mode of the NBN, so I'm sorry, can't do a compare and contrast of the rollout situation now versus a rollout schedule that might have occurred under a previous model. I'm sorry.
Dr. Allen. Do we have you, Dr. Allen?
I have me, but can you?
Yes, we can. No, we don't. Katie, Dr. Allen, can you hear us? I think we're going to have to proceed. I'll ask another question in the hope that Dr. Allen might be able to get her technology working. The NBN Co recently introduced a $35 wholesale 12.1 megabyte entry-level bundle. This entry-level bundle aims to make broadband more affordable for around 500,000 budget-conscious households. What other measures is NBN Co exploring to support low-income households and lift NBN take-up in these under-penetrated segments?
Thank you. Mr. Madsen might be able to respond to that one.
Yep, I think we may have partially answered this in some of our earlier responses, in that NBN has been consulting with its retail customers and with consumer groups on measures that it could adopt to improve take-up of services for those that haven't taken up an NBN service. And so it's consulting on in the first instance, what barriers may be preventing households from taking up a service of the small number that haven't currently done so, and in response to that, what sort of new products it may look at developing to address those take-up challenges. And in doing that, it's working with consumer groups. And it's looking at different categories of households, whether it's low-income households or elderly households with where there might be elderly people, where there may be some barrier in terms of understanding of the technology. As we also mentioned, NBN has made a number of recent changes to its prices, which will also continue to make sure that NBN services remain affordable and affordable across the full range of products that they offer. And I suppose our observation that we'd make there is that households that may have some financial constraint are not always looking for a low-speed plan. They're often looking for plans that have higher capacity. And perhaps the other thing to mention there also is when we look at availability of broadband services, we look at it across all of the different networks that are available. So for some households, choosing a mobile service will be a good fit for their needs. And that's, I suppose, what we're looking at, that there are across all the different networks, that there are products that are meeting consumer needs.
Senator Davey.
Thanks, Chair. Just in the absence of Dr. Allen, whoops, I've lost my page, sorry.
I can see Dr. Allen on the screen. Can I hear her?
Can you hear me? I'm trying to talk.
Oh, there she is.
Yes, fantastic.
Oh, good. Okay.
Over to you, Dr. Allen.
Thank you. Sorry, I've been in and out a little bit, so it's been not as ideal as I would have liked. I'm actually interested in the wholesale aspect of NBN and how it's dealing with the wholesale pricing regulation of NBN. Sorry. Let me just find where I had my points that I've written down. Sorry. So I'm not sure whether this question has already been asked or not because I missed out on something, but can the committee, would you be able to look at the outcomes of the 2019 wholesale pricing review, or has that already been answered?
No, it hasn't at this point. Thank you.
I can talk to that one. As you pointed to, last year NBN Co undertook an extensive consultation process with retailers to determine its future pricing roadmap. And so on the 26th of November, it announced that 2-year wholesale pricing roadmap which would apply for the following 2 years. That involved a range of new products and enhanced products, including reduced pricing for a number of the speed tiers. As I think we've talked about before in relation to the provisioning of data within those plans, that roadmap sets out a process for CVC increases over the course of the 2 years. NBN Co also, as part of that, committed to a number of other product improvements as a result of that consultation. So that included over-dimensioning the majority of its speed tiers, which ensures customers get the maximum possible speed for their broadband plan. And in addition, NBN Co introduced something called national pooling of CVC, which enables the retailers greater flexibility to share CVC between the points of interconnect on the NBN network. Most recently, on the 29th of May, NBN Co introduced its new high-speed residential plans. So that includes a home fast plan, which offers speeds of up to 100 megabits per second and 20 megabits per second upload, a super fast plan, which is a 250 megabits per second product, and a home ultra fast plan, which has a download range of between 500 and 1,000 megabits per second. So over time, those new pricing approaches have been implemented, including over the COVID period in May. A number of plans experienced an increase in the included CVC. So that, as we talked about before, with the transition away from the CVC boost over COVID, will help manage that transition as well.
Great, thank you. Could I ask a follow-on question from that? So what impact has this had on increasing competition and choice, and that impact on the product offerings that are available in a competitive sense?
Sorry, no, feel free.
I think the broader the range of products that NBN offers into the market at a wholesale level, and in a sense offers much greater opportunity for flexibility and design in packages at the retail level. And there have been some examples in recent times of retailers beginning to take slightly more, to kind of set themselves up and approach the market in particular ways. So some might have taken a particular view to try and turn their mind to higher speed plans. Some have looked to, offer products into the market that, differentiate themselves from their retail competitors. So I think as a general rule, I'd say the more we see NBN innovate and adjust and increase the number of products it offers at the wholesale level, the more opportunity there is for differentiation by retailers and more opportunity for retailers to meet the variety of consumer needs out there.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful.
If I could ask a further question. So telecommunication companies such as Telstra and Vocus have raised concerns that NBN Co is providing services directly to enterprise customers in contravention of the requirements contained in the Statement of Expectations that NBN Co provided wholesale services only. Just interested if you'd like to comment on the behaviour of NBN Co in the enterprise market.
Look, I'll make some comments, and it may be that potentially some other comments from my colleagues. But look, in general, I think we would start by saying it was always intended that NBN connect enterprise, premises of so-called enterprise businesses. So there's nothing alarming from our perspective in the fact that NBN is out there connecting enterprise customers. But obviously we and we would observe that I think NBN's entry into that market has increased the level of competition in some parts of the country for enterprise level services, and that I think is a welcome addition to the Australian telecommunications market. Obviously, we would be concerned if if NBN was found to be acting anti-competitively, and that is something that we would be worried about and would keep an eye on, and I think more importantly the ACCC would be keeping a close eye on. So, but as a general observation, their entry into the enterprise market has offered some increase in competition and was always envisaged in terms of the NBN, the approach of the NBN. More specifically on the point you raised about the concerns Telstra and Vocus have raised, NBN has, I think over recent times, paid quite close attention to the concerns that have been raised by its customers, and has undertaken a variety of consultation processes and made some decisions to adjust its approach to the enterprise market to take into account some of the concerns raised by Telstra, Vocus and others around the issue you raised. I might just throw to my colleague who might be able to give you a little bit more detail on the steps that NBN has taken in relation to that sort of issue.
Thank you, Richard. And Ms Power might also have some observations, but just more specifically, there have been two particular consultation processes that NBN has been undertaking. One has been on where it may make use of fibre infrastructure that is already installed to complement its own network. I suppose when we look at the business market, we understand that in densely populated areas and CBD areas, there are a number of existing fibre networks that often serve larger businesses, and in those areas, NBN Co has been consulting on how when it's preparing a product to respond to a particular customer, it could use a mix of its own fibre and fibre that may be available from one of the existing carriers. And I think that's been welcomed by those existing carriers, as it's seen to be making the most of any investment in new fibre. But by making that available, it also means that businesses that are looking for a service have a greater range of choice about who they can go to obtain a business grade service. As through that process, retailers can choose to use NBN's network to connect to those businesses, which is providing more choice for those businesses and through that increased competition, putting pressure and delivering more affordable prices. I mentioned also there's a second consultation process which has been around evolving the contracting model that NBN has undertaken, and through that process NBN has committed that it will undertake its contracting through its retail service providers so that the retail market will continue to be the driver of services for business customers, and with NBN still providing information and gathering information from businesses so that it can continue to evolve and enhance its products. I might just ask Ms Power if there's anything else that we could add.
I'd just say, yes, the sort of conclusion to that consultation process happened very recently. NBN Co issued its closeout paper, as it calls it, on the 19th of June. So through that process, they identified what might be the preferred models for dealing with that enterprise contracting model. And so through that closeout paper, NBN Co confirmed that based on retailer feedback, that there were going to be a combination of two potential models, called a 3-year deal module and a downstream payment arrangement. And so NBN Co has now committed to finalise the details and the implementation arrangements for that, and with a view to kind of progressing to the next stage of that in early July. So that essentially rounds out that process, and NBN Co will continue to engage with stakeholders as that plays out.
Excellent. Colleagues, that brings us to the conclusion of the last half hour of the evidence of the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications. I've received a note from Ms Templeman suggesting that there are some additional questions on notice, I think in particular from you, Ms Phillips. I'm proposing that they be put to the department on notice. To Senator Griff and Dr Haynes, do you have any questions on notice that you might wish to submit?
Yes, I will, Chair.
No worries. Well, to officers of the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications, can I thank you for your attendance? Can I indicate to you the committee has agreed that answers to questions on notice should be provided by the 24th of July. In addition to the ones I just mentioned, there were a number of requests put to you during the course of the hearing this morning. I thank you again, not only for your attendance, but in anticipation of the work you will do in answer of those questions on notice. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much.
We'll move, colleagues, as quickly as practicable to the department, to the witnesses from the Department of Finance. If you can just bear with us while we do that administratively. I understand, Madam Secretary, that we have Ms Stacey Hall, the First Assistant Secretary, Commercial Investment Division, Commercial and General Services, on the video conference line. Is that right?
That's right. We're just trying to connect her now, Chair, but we have the other witnesses from the department in the room with us.
Excellent. For reasons that relate principally to ensuring we operate expeditiously, I now welcome representatives of the Department of Finance. I obviously thank them for taking the time to give evidence today. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? And hopefully, as that's happening, we'll be able to connect with Ms Hall.
Chair, while they're getting settled, can I just indicate, Chair, while they're getting settled, that we can see already we will not have time in this session to get through the questions that we have. So we'd just like to flag a request for a future hearing with the Department of Finance, because we can just already see, given we're starting late, I'm not sure how much time there will be for going over. So I'd just like to put that on the record, and can we explore options for subsequent hearings?
Sure, we can do that perhaps at the conclusion of this meeting, or more likely during an administrative meeting in the future. Over to the officers of the Department of Finance.
Good morning. I'm Andrew Jaggers, Deputy Secretary, Commercial and Government Services at the Department of Finance, and I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Hugh Atkin, Assistant Secretary, Communications and Energy Investments Branch in the Department of Finance.
And Tracy Carroll, First Assistant Secretary, Financial Analysis, Reporting and Management Division at the Department of Finance.
Madam Secretary, have we had any luck in relation to Ms Hall?
We haven't thus far, Chair. If we don't have any luck in the near future, we'll drop her in just via audio.
Excellent. I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of your remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions. You may not have an opening statement, but it's available to you.
Chair, we don't have an opening statement, but I might just explain that Ms Hall's trying to join remotely. She has some mild cold symptoms and didn't want to come into the committee room today out of an abundance of caution, but hopefully she'll get on the phone fairly soon, and we'll try to manage the sort of questions between the four of us.
No, it's fine. I'm sure the people in the room are grateful for Ms Hall taking those precautions. I'll hand over to either Dr Haynes or Senator Griff.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses from the Department of Finance for appearing today. My first question, has the department been asked to take any preparation work for the sale or privatisation of the NBN?
The department isn't undertaking any preparatory works for the sale of NBN at the moment. So the process for the sale of NBN is sort of outlined under the National Broadband Network Companies Act, and there are a number of steps that are required to occur before a privatisation could be pursued. Those steps are that the Minister for Communications would need to declare the network fully built and operational. There'd need to be a Productivity Commission inquiry into the regulatory, budgetary, consumer and competition matters relating to NBN, and there'd also be a Parliamentary Joint Committee would consider the findings of that report. The Minister for Finance would need to make a disallowable declaration, and then, provided that declaration wasn't disallowed, then a privatisation could be pursued. So none of those sort of precursors or steps have been taken.
Oh, no sound. We can't
Dr.
hear you.
Haynes, I can't hear you. I don't think others can.
Sorry. I understand that the department's shareholder responsibilities include providing advice on financing strategies and processes, future ownership arrangements and ongoing service delivery. Could you explain to the committee what involvement the department has in the development of NBN Co's operational and financial forecasts?
Yeah, so every year NBN undertakes a fairly rigorous corporate planning process, and shareholder departments are involved in that process of the corporate plan. So we work with NBN quite closely as they develop their corporate plan so that we understand the details of that plan, how it's developing. That will often involve the financial forecast that NBN is undertaking. So we might provide feedback to NBN in that process of their plan. And I think that we usually the draft corporate plans are provided to agencies around the end of June, and then up until, we work with the companies up until they're finalised at the end of August, and in that time frame they're also considered by shareholder ministers for any feedback that shareholder ministers might have on the plan. But I might ask Mr Atkin if he wanted to expand on the work that we do with NBN.
Thank you. So as Mr Jaggers explained, each year we sort of undertake a sort of rigorous corporate plan review process on the back of the draft corporate plan that is provided to shareholder ministers. That process involves testing sort of the underlying assumptions, but obviously the company or NBN Co is responsible for developing its own operational and financial forecasts, which we would undertake a review of. That process often involves the inclusion of an expert advisor to assist with the review, and culminates in advice to shareholder ministers on the corporate plan, and ultimately results in the publication of the final corporate plan by the end of August.
Thank you. Have you sought any advice on the impact of 5G on revenue forecasts and the internal rate of return for the NBN?
So revenue forecasts are a key matter that's kind of discussed through the corporate planning process. I probably couldn't do as good a job as Mr Windier in answering this question. Similar question about 5G. Previously, he talked to the role that 5G might play in the telecommunications market going forward. I think from our perspective, our focus is really on that revenue sort of forecast, and if NBN in its corporate planning process is changing its forecasts, and so I think that its current corporate plan indicates a take-up rate of around 73 to 75% on fixed line areas, and currently its fixed line areas are tracking at about 64%. So I think it's projecting that the take-up rate for NBN is going to continue to increase over the current corporate plan period. And in this corporate plan coming up, we'll be working with NBN to see how those figures are being adjusted, and NBN will need to take into account a whole range of factors. 5G would be one of those, but there'll be a range of sort of other factors that impact on its financial position and its revenues it's expecting. So we're in the process of working through that, looking at those impacts on revenue and other areas of the business at the moment for the next corporate plan.
Okay, thank you. I've got no further questions.
Thank you.
Senator Griff.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Mr Jaggers, I imagine you'd possibly be able to answer this question, I would hope. The government officially records the value of NBN Co as $29.5 billion, yet the Parliamentary Budget Office estimates the fair value of NBN Co as $8.7 billion. How do you account for this discrepancy?
I might ask my colleague, Ms Carroll, to answer that.
Yeah, thank you. Senator, value in the Australian Government financial statements for the NBN, the investment in NBN, is established in line with Australian accounting standards. So that's the same for all aspects of the Australian Government's financial statements. And so it is in fact that value that you called out, the $8 billion. I'm not sure I've got the exact figure here. It is in fact what is the value of NBN reflected in the Australian Government financial statements. So the difference, the $29.5 billion that you refer to, would relate to the equity invested by the government in relation to the NBN. Each year, and that's the process that we'll be going through now for the 2019-20 financial year, there's a process of looking at what is the value of all aspects on the balance sheet for the Australian government. So there'll be a process that's undertaken this year to determine what's the value of the equity investment of the government in the NBN. So the difference, the reason why there would be a difference between what was invested and the value recorded now. So right now, the NBN is valued for the Australian government. Again, there's a couple of methods that are set out in the Australian accounting standards so that they can be valued either on a net assets basis, which is the method that is undertaken for the NBN up to the 2018-19 financial year. That is a method that is normally appropriate for a business that might be in a start-up phase. The other method that could be undertaken to value an equity investment for, such as a company like NBN, would be to look at future cash flows and to value it in relation to future cash flows. But for that change in methodology for the valuation of NBN, it would need to consider some stability and certainty in relation to future cash flows. And so that's a process that the Infrastructure Department this year would be working through as they settle their financial statements.
Okay, what's the timing for that? When do you think that will...
So end of financial year is 30 June, and then there is a requirement that entities complete their financial statements as soon as practicable after the end of financial year, and they will be working through with the Australian National Audit Office to settle completion of those financial statements and audit of those financial statements. They would normally be published, or they will be published, in the infrastructure financial statements, in the infrastructure annual report, which would be tabled generally in October, I would expect.
Okay, so effectively the difference between equity invested and fair value, effectively it represents a loss to the Commonwealth.
Yes, but explainable probably in the circumstances now that NBN is in a startup phase of its business, and that is what you would normally expect in the startup phase of a business, is that you would take the equity that was given to the business and then there are higher levels of expenditure until the business in fact turns into a profitable business. So it is not unusual to expect that the equity in NBN, the government's equity in NBN, would be lower than that was initially invested.
NBN Co holds a $19.5 billion debt facility with the government, and in 2018 the date of repayment was extended from next year, 2021 to 2024. Now, does the department currently expect the loan to be repaid on time, and how do you actually monitor NBN's financial capacity?
So, Senator, we expect the loan to be repaid by 2024, which is the current date. We have a commercial arrangement with NBN. We have an agreement with NBN for it to be repaid by that date, and that's fully our expectation. We receive very regular sort of financial updates from NBN, I think on a quarterly basis and a monthly basis. So we're quite closely connected with the financials of the company. I think with the loan, we would expect to work with NBN over the next period on the repayment schedule for that loan. Certainly you'd be aware that NBN has gone to market for some private financing recently, and we would expect that NBN will work with us on the timing for when it goes to markets for debt specifically for the purpose of repaying the Commonwealth loan. You wouldn't expect that those discussions to proceed too far until NBN has actually completed the rollout, the initial rollout of the network, which is getting close to doing. But then we'd expect to be in discussions in each corporate planning process about the strategies for the repayment of the Commonwealth debt.
Just on that, you made reference to the private sector debt, which I think was $6 billion.
Yes.
How much of this will be used to pay down its debt to the Commonwealth, and would NBN have remained solvent if it had not been raised?
So there hasn't been any agreement or plan to use that debt to pay down the Commonwealth loan. The NBN went to markets in December last year, initially for to seek $2 billion.
Perfect.
Cool, thank you.
I'm not sure if we've got someone else on the line.
Yeah, I think that might be Ms. Hall may have just joined us. Is that correct?
Hello.
Is that you, Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Okay. Can you just thank you for joining us, and if you can just make sure your microphone's on mute unless you're speaking. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I might throw to Ms. Hall from time to time, if that's okay, Chair.
Of course.
But we just returning to the question about the debt. So NBN went to market in December. It was looking to secure around $2 billion of debt, and that debt is required to, for the completion of the rollout of the network. It secured $6.1 billion on reasonable terms, and entered into sort of arrangements that allow it to draw down up to $6.1 billion. So other than the $2 billion, which is for the purpose of continuing with the rollout, NBN's also indicated that $1.5 billion will be reserved for working capital to provide the company with some flexibility, but it hasn't made any decisions on drawing down the remainder of that 6.1. And in fact, it doesn't need to draw down on that debt facility immediately, but it will provide some additional flexibility for the company going forward.
So NBN would have been solvent if it didn't have that debt raising?
Oh, no, I couldn't comment on that, Senator.
Okay. Would the department have concerns about a Telstra-led entity acquiring the NBN?
Well, I think as I outlined before, the NBN sale process is outlined in the Act, and there's quite a detailed process and quite a process that involves quite significant sort of oversight from a range of entities, including the Parliament, and also through the ACCC as well. So I think, I couldn't speculate on any potential buyer at some point in the future when those preconditions for a sale may or may not occur.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Chair.
I take it, does that mean, Senator Griff, you've concluded with your questions?
Look, yes, and we'd be happy for the opposition to pick up any excess time that we have on this.
Yeah, that's fine. Over to you, Ms. Templeman.
And I'm going to ask Tim Watts to start the questioning.
Thank you, Chair and Deputy Chair. So you can hear me loud and clear?
Yes, Senator. Mr. Watts, sorry.
Excellent. Don't give me a demotion. So for the benefit of the committee, I wonder if you could explain to us what the concept of peak funding is for NBN Co and how that's defined.
So peak funding was was described as the maximum or the high point in terms of funding required for the completion of the network, taking into account cash flows in and out of the business during the construction period.
to borrow $2 billion to support those peak funding requirements.
Sorry,
now on 12 May.
Mr. Watts, I think you're coming in and out unless it's just me.
No, I couldn't hear that last question.
It is cutting in and out.
Cutting in and out? Okay, well, let me know if you lose me. But so NBN Co was intended to borrow $2 billion from private debt markets to support these peak funding requirements. And on 12, NBN Co reported to have taken a $6.1 billion debt facility instead. So it was $4 billion more than was intended. So when did NBN Co first approach the market to find $2 billion in private debt?
So NBN approached the market in December last year to secure at least $2 billion for the completion of the rollout of the network. So essentially, the Australian government's sort of peak commitment through equity and debt for NBN was $49 billion. NBN sought an additional $2 billion from private markets to assist in the completion of the rollout of the network, and it started that process in December 2019. The market response was very good in terms of debt providers, banks and the like offering debt facilities at appropriate sort of terms for NBN, and its board took a decision that it would create facilities for up to $6.1 billion, which it did. That funding hasn't been drawn down. Certainly not all of that funding has been drawn down. In fact, I don't think any has been drawn down yet. But it has the flexibility to now use that $2 billion for the completion of the network, and then it will retain a portion of that extra debt facility for working capital or for flexibility, and then it will consider whether the uses of the remaining capital if it needs it, and if there are appropriate capital investments that are required for NBN. It has that sort of flexibility to either bring some capital investments forward or to generate sort of new business opportunities. And so what we would expect is that...
So when did NBN Co first raise their desire to take on more than $2 billion in private debt with the government?
I'd have to take that on notice in terms of when it was first raised with us, but there would have been sort of conversations with the shareholder departments while it was working with the markets around the debt packages, and we would have been trying to work quite closely with NBN during that process so that we're in a position to advise our shareholder ministers on NBN's plans, and also NBN would have put its proposal at some point formally to the ministers, but we would have understood what was being proposed before then. I might ask Mr. Atkin if he has anything else to add to that at this point.
No, I think that, yeah. We worked very closely with the company through the first part of this the second part of this financial year, through the bank debt raising process, and as Mr. Jaggers outlined, the company approached the market for $2 billion as outlined in the corporate plan, and it was successful in that sort of debt raising process such that the amount it was seeking was oversubscribed, and that led to it taking a decision to secure the $6.1 billion in financing.
Strong response from debt markets there. So do you feel that the revenues and cash flows for NBN Co are more predictable? I mean, presumably this is what NBN Co is telling the markets. You'd need to tell the markets to get a sort of strong response like that.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the first part of that question. Would you mind just repeating it for us?
Repeating it.
Sorry about that.
Do you feel that the project is now reaching a point where revenues and cash flows are more predictable?
Well, certainly we think every year there's greater predictability in the revenues and cash flows. That's right. So we think that obviously the market's responded positively to the information that NBN's been able to provide, and as the network reaches sort of completion of the initial rollout of the network, and more and more customers sort of come on board, I think there's obviously a greater predictability as estimates become actuals each year and in each corporate plan. So we would expect this corporate plan, there'll be a greater level of certainty in those future revenue flows than there was certainly in last year's corporate plan.
It was a watershed moment, though, going to a private debt market with those revenues and cash flows, and actually making representations to the market about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a demonstration of support for the company, and I guess just to provide some actual data to support that, the revenue forecast for this financial year are 3.7 billion. And as at the third quarter, at the end of March, NBN Co had achieved revenues of 2.8 billion. So that was about 38% above what they were forecasting to achieve in that amount of time. So I mean, the signs in terms of performance against corporate plan targets from a revenue perspective are positive, and I think that's evidenced by the strong support received in the approach to debt markets.
Okay, great. So was this additional debt facility inconsistent with the equity agreement NBN Co had with the Commonwealth as of July 2019?
No, the arrangements with the private debt holders are not inconsistent with the equity agreements that we have with NBN or the debt facility agreement that we have with NBN for our current debt package.
Okay. So the step by NBN Co to take on an additional $4 billion in debt, potentially, was that approved by Cabinet or just shareholder ministers?
It was a decision of government.
Yeah, it was a decision of government, yes. Cabinet.
So the government, is that I can take that to be of Cabinet?
Yeah, so it's a decision of Cabinet.
Okay, thank you. And what type of financial assessment did shareholder departments undertake in relation to this? Who was engaged to perform that assessment, and what department oversaw it?
So we engaged closely with our partner agency, Department of Infrastructure and Communications, and we also engaged an expert advisory firm that was Lazard. And it was Lazard in this case, thank you. It was Lazard, and they worked quite closely with both teams in analysing the proposals that were put forward by NBN prior to consideration by ministers and then Cabinet.
Okay, and when did that assessment begin and finish?
I might just ask Ms Hall and Mr Atkin if they can comment.
Senators, good morning. Stacey Hall, First Assistant Secretary, Department of Finance. Apologies for not being able to join some of you in person today, but appreciating the benefit of being able to utilise the technology. Departments engaged Lazard and worked with NBN Co through the process of consideration of its approach to market. So it approached the market in late 2019, and prior to that time, there had been close consultation with government through the shareholder departments about that proposed approach to market. Government initially agreed that NBN Co could approach the market, and then there was a requirement for NBN Co to return with the results of that approach for further government consideration and decisions around the establishment of additional private debt facilities, and Lazard was assisting throughout that process from late last year through to government consideration in the first part of 2020.
Okay, and what's the status of the private debt facility relative to the debt provided by the Commonwealth here? Do private debt holders have higher status or claims on assets than the Commonwealth?
No, the debt is ranked equal to the Commonwealth debt.
Okay, are there any conditions attached to the debt facility?
There are a range of conditions. Obviously, there's there are a range of sort of transparency and conditions that apply to the Commonwealth's arrangement with NBN Co.
It might just be worth explaining. The arrangement that we have with NBN Co is written down in a commercial terms loan, so it's a properly constructed contractual arrangement that we have with NBN in relation to the Commonwealth debt.
Okay, and what's the shareholder equity agreement adjusted in light of the additional $4 billion?
No. The $29.5 billion equity contribution has been fully committed, and so the primary document that sort of governs the use of financing arrangements between the Commonwealth and the company is, as Mr. Jaggers outlined, the Commonwealth loan agreement.
Okay. Now, the media release announcing this debt raising provides a quote, "The additional funding will provide the company opportunities to invest and create even more value for Australians, guided by future corporate plans." Can you explain what this means? What would NBN Co be investing in this context?
Sorry, Mr. Watts, can I just be clear, is for my benefit, probably more than the witnesses, when you say the media release, issued by whom? Sorry.
This is the media release announcing the debt raising.
And yeah, but who released it?
This is the government media release.
Thank you.
So in each corporate plan, NBN will outline its capital expenditure proposals and what it intends to do over the next 4 years. That will include a range of investments in different technologies. Obviously, the focus of that has been the rollout of NBN, the mixed rollout of NBN. But certainly in each corporate plan, that capital expenditure will be outlined, and what ministers were indicating in that media release was that the extra debt that's being able to be raised could be put towards other value-creating sort of assets within NBN. So NBN would and they've linked that to future corporate plans, which indicates that that new investment opportunities would be outlined in corporate plans and go through that usual corporate planning process that involves departments and ministers, and then they're settled in August in the final corporate planning process. So I think it's just flagging that there is capacity for either the bring forward of some capital expenditure or new capital expenditure within that extra debt that had been generated. It doesn't mean it has to happen. It doesn't mean that any extra projects will come forward to use that debt, but it's certainly a possibility that ministers were flagging in their media release at the time of the debt raising.
Chair, if I could just...
And what's the debt?
Chair, if I could just add for the benefit of the members of the committee, the media release was issued by Minister Cormann and Minister Fletcher on the 12th of May 2020.
Thank you.
Yes. What's the definition of value we're talking about here? We're talking about the commercial rate of return, of social or economic benefit. What are the principles that are governing the use of this word value in the release here?
Well, I'm not sure I want to put a definition on the words that the ministers used in their media release. I think that it talked about create value for Australians guided by future corporate plans. I think what we would say is that, from a departmental perspective, is that if in NBN's planning process, they're looking to outline projects and investments that have a positive impact on the value of the business and the company, then that's something we would certainly provide advice to government on in terms of the impact of those investments on the company. And I think that ministers are kind of indicating that you'd want to see positive value in future investments. So I'm not sure I could really pull apart exactly what ministers mean in their statement in the statement, but I think that's how we would interpret it.
Okay. So it could have a positive or a negative effect on the economics of the NBN. Could be a value in terms of the business case, could be a value in terms of NBN co, social or economic.
I kind of missed the start of that. I'm not quite sure.
Perhaps if you could repeat it, Mr. Watts.
I said, so it could have a positive or a negative impact on the economics of NBN Co, on the internal business economics of the NBN Co, or it could be, it could be an external value that benefits the Australian community, social or economic.
Well, I think that in issuing this release, ministers were indicating that the amount of private debt that had been secured by NBN was positive, that they'd gone to market seeking up to $2 billion, but there'd been a positive response, and that positive response from the markets and the terms of that debt package enable NBN to complete the rollout, but also gives some flexibility for future decision making. That would be a matter for NBN and the board, and also to the extent that ministers would need to approve any investments, if that's a requirement for certain investments, or in the corporate planning process that ministers were indicating that it gives flexibility for investments that create value in the company. So I don't think they were indicating much more than that.
Okay. So outside that corporate plan process, are there any conditions on how NBN Co can invest the additional $4 billion in debt? Or are these set out in any letter or agreement?
No, there is a public statement of expectations that ministers have put in place for the company that provides guidance. There's also the GBE guidelines that provide sort of guidance to companies in terms of how they work through and develop their corporate plan. But there hasn't been any specific direction of ministers in relation to this extra private debt raising. So what you'd expect and what we would expect is that as NBN considers whether it wants to draw down any further amount from those debt facilities, that they would indicate that in their corporate planning process that will be settled in at the end of August. And during that corporate plan process, both departments have an opportunity to analyse NBN's financial statements, its position, the impact of any investments. Then we're in a position to provide feedback to NBN in relation to that and work with them on those proposals. We'd also provide advice to ministers who may also wish to comment on the corporate plan prior to the board settling the corporate plan in August.
Okay. Now, if NBN Co had not secured this debt facility, would it have gone over its $51 billion peak funding profile by financial year 2023?
So I think in last year's corporate plan that envisaged going to market for the debt in order to use those funds to complete the rollout of the network, that was an agreed strategy that they executed quite successfully during the period. So that does enable them to fund the completion of the rollout as agreed in their last corporate plan. So we're pleased that they've been able to do that.
But peak funding increases even post rollout, though, doesn't it? I mean, it's primarily the funding NBN Co needs for pre and post rollout operations, as well as Telstra payments until it's cash flow positive in FY23, right?
Yeah, so we obviously sort of track their financial performance over not just the corporate plan period, but estimates beyond. So clearly they needed to go to market to get the debt to complete the rollout, which they've achieved, and then they will look to, as cash flows continue to improve, as Mr. Atkin mentioned before, revenues continue to improve, they will become cash flow positive at some point. That point will be identified in sort of the next corporate plan. In this corporate plan, Mr. Atkin, did you want to comment on where it is at this corporate plan?
So the current corporate plan forecasts cash flow positive by financial year 2022-23.
Okay. Can you confirm that the NBN project will require more than $51 billion peak funding profile when combining public equity, public debt and private debt?
We couldn't confirm that statement.
So the extra $4 billion in debt optionality, you're saying that can't be part of peak funding because it's not related to the initial rollout?
Well, I think that the peak funding concept was to explain those cash flows during the rollout of the network. At a point, as Mr. Atkin has said, the company does become cash flow positive. It starts to pay down debt. But it'll still need to invest in new technologies and invest in the future. But yes, the peak funding terminology was really just focused on how much it's going to cost to complete the initial rollout of the network. It's not kind of a normal metric that companies would use in their general operation of business. Would rely more on their revenue position, their net profit position, and debt and equity returns as kind of key metrics for the company, rather than tracking a peak funding beyond the initial rollout, I think.
So it's potential that there will be an additional peak in funding after the conclusion of the rollout.
Senator, Chair, perhaps I could assist with that. So at the moment, based on NBN's 2023 corporate plan, the forecast peak funding level of 51 billion remains the same. That's the most recent corporate plan. We haven't received the financial information in relation to the coming year yet. So the 51 billion, as you'd be aware, was made up of 49 billion in Commonwealth debt, in Commonwealth equity and debt, and 2 billion of private debt. As at the 31st of May, which is the most recent financial information we have, NBN had drawn 1 billion in private debt. And so as on the basis of the information we have at this time, through the course of the current financial year, NBN remains within that 51 billion peak funding envelope. And as Mr. Jaggers said, that was the funding required to complete the initial scale rollout by June 2020. So on the basis of the information as we have it at the moment, they are on track to complete or have completed the scale rollout within that peak funding envelope.
So, but if next year there's an NBN Co proposes spending some of that extra $4 billion in debt that it has a facility for, and that $2 billion of private debt as part of the 51 goes to $4 billion, that's not going to increase peak funding as defined by the government.
Well, I guess that's hypothetical, and it's really quite difficult to answer. As I said, we haven't received NBN Co's 2021-24 corporate plan yet. It remains subject to consideration by government, as Mr. Jaggers has attested to, in coming months, and so there are no decisions or agreements at this time that would see NBN Co exceed that currently agreed limit, but these are matters for government consideration in the context of the upcoming corporate plan.
It's more than just hypothetical, though, isn't it? I mean, there is a additional $4 billion debt facility sitting here with a fairly amorphous definition of what the government proposes it might be spent on. I think we heard earlier that it might be used to change the capex profile of NBN Co. It might be used for new investments. I don't know, is that going to be in fibre to business enterprises? We don't know. So it's more than a hypothetical, that the money is there that could be spent.
Well, certainly there is an ability for NBN to draw down additional debt for agreed projects in the next corporate plan, if that's something that they seek to do, and if government agrees that makes sort of sense. But certainly when we talk about peak funding, I think when you asked originally about what peak funding was, I think we certainly describe that concept as the during the build phase of the project. NBN goes from a build to operational phase, so the company does need to transition, and it will need to make new investments to keep its offering in line with what the market's demanding and what individuals need in terms of fixed line broadband services into the future. So I think we probably can't add much more to what we've said, that during the corporate planning process those matters will be considered. But at this stage, NBN has a debt facility. It intends to use $2 billion of that in accordance with the last corporate plan to complete the initial rollout of the network. And then any future sort of drawdowns on that facility would be a matter for the NBN board and then government consideration.
And does the government remain committed to having NBN Co refinance issued debt by FY 2024?
I think you're asking about the refinancing of the Commonwealth loan. So the loan is expected to be refinanced by 30th of June 2024. We would expect to be in discussions with NBN Co about the plan for refinancing. NBN is required to come back with a refinancing plan. We do have a commercial agreement with NBN around that, and so if we, but we do know that achieving a debt package for NBN of $19.5 billion to repay the Commonwealth loan will take some work and will take some time. So we're quite conscious of the fact that we'll need to work with NBN on the repayment of that loan, but it's certainly expected to be refinanced by June 2024.
Okay, going back to that May 12 release by shareholder Min, the release states that from the additional $4.1 billion debt facilities, $1.5 billion will be reserved for working capital to provide the company with added flexibility and to support NBN Co's long-term capital management strategy. For the benefit of the committee, can you clarify what working capital is and why additional debt is needed to support working capital requirements? I'm interested here in what new working capital requirements have arisen between now and was issued in August 2019.
Certainly. So I might ask Mr. Atkin to comment on working capital.
Thanks, Mr. Jaggers. So working capital in a general sense is managed to, or is used to manage the difference between sort of current assets and current liabilities. And NBN, I think you alluded to before to the lumpy nature of sort of NBN's cash flows and the Telstra subscriber payments. So that's perhaps an example of how working capital would be used to facilitate those cash flows as and when they fall due, up until the point at which they become cash flow positive in 22-23.
So what new working capital requirements have arisen between now and the last corporate plan issued in August 2019?
So I'm not aware that there's explicitly a new requirement for working capital, other than that that was identified as part of the the recent the debt raising that took place.
Okay, so that this private debt was always going to be applied primarily to working capital?
I think the intention had always been to apply the $2 billion, to apply $2 billion to the completion of the rollout, and certainly they've also looked at, in terms of the rest of the flexibility that's created by the $6.1 billion, they've indicated that $1.5 billion would be reserved for working capital, so they could have flexibility to draw down that and if it's required, and particularly for things like, as Mr. Atkin mentioned, the Telstra sort of agreements, there are payments that are required to be made periodically, and so having access to a working capital facility helps NBN to meet those cash flows at the time that they're needed. So that's always sort of been the case, that they've needed working capital, but now it's kind of explicitly, as the equity has been put into the company, the Commonwealth loan's been put into the company, the Commonwealth's contribution of $49 billion has settled as the last bit of the loan is drawn out over the next few weeks, a few months. Just clarifying with Mr. Atkin. That working capital facility will help them to meet those peaks and troughs in spending. The extent to which that needs to be drawn down, I'm not aware of. I'd have to kind of take that on notice and can maybe come back to you with a bit more detail.
Okay. I'd just like to come back briefly to this concept of peak funding. Originally, so peak funding is funding requirements before NBN Co goes cash flow positive. And this has in the past been explicitly tied to the government's on-budget commitment. So in the 2020 corporate plan, you see the $51 billion peak funding commitment goes out to financial year 2022. It's not tied to the conclusion of the network rollout.
Sorry, you're
sort of dealing with those.
Yeah, I'm explaining how we have considered peak funding. So the corporate plan will has talked about $51 billion. I think that you're right in saying that peak happens at a certain time frame, and that is sort of varied through our corporate plans as information has and forecasting has sort of changed. But it was certainly the concept of peak funding was certainly designed around the initial rollout of the network. But you're right in saying that corporate plans have put different timeframes on when that peak might be reached. I mean, every forecast is exactly that, a forecast at the time of the corporate plan that is settled at that time.
Well, this is, I mean, the 2020 corporate plan provides that $51 billion peak funding will be reached in financial year 2022.
I'm not sure what the question is. I'm sorry.
I mean, that's the year we're in at the moment. I'm just trying to get to. I mean, you're sort of saying you'll reach peak funding at the conclusion of the rollout. I'm just saying that the NBN Co corporate plan says that it'll be reached in financial year 2022. I'm interested in the interaction here between the additional debt. Further funding is drawn down on that debt facility in the next 2 years, leading into that financial year 2022. Will that figure in the corporate plan change? Will that peak funding figure of $51 billion be exceeded?
I think that the debt facility, the up to $6.1 billion of debt facility, there need to be decisions taken by NBN about whether they need to want to plan to draw that down. Those decisions and for what purpose, and the purpose and timing of that would have an impact on a number of metrics, but there haven't been decisions taken on that, and I think we, as the Minister's kind of statement indicated, that would happen in the corporate planning period, and then that'd be a matter for future decisions. So I think you're asking whether, because they can draw down the debt, will that have an impact on that peak funding metric, which I've described as sort of a metric that was created for sort of understanding the peak flows during the rollout. And I think the only answer I can provide is there hasn't been any decisions to draw down that remaining debt beyond where it's sort of agreed in the current corporate planning process. So that'll be sort of a matter for future decisions in the future corporate plan, which is sort of under development at the moment.
So we should wait for the 2021 corporate plan to see whether that peak funding goes beyond 51 billion.
Yeah, well, the next corporate plan will outline the next set of metrics, yes.
Okay. Now, that May release by shareholder ministers also states that, quote, the balance of funds is available for strategic investments with a positive return beyond the initial rollout phase and repayment of the Commonwealth loan subject to shareholder approval, end quote. Can you give an example of what a strategic investment is?
I can. I think just in general terms, there's some guidance in the GBE guidelines on the way that we would look at business cases. And just to run you through the sorts of things that we would look at, we'd be looking for the rationale of the initiative and an explanation as to how it fits within the GBE's corporate strategy. And obviously the statement of expectations would be another factor that's relevant to that consideration. We'd also look at the costs and the anticipated return, and I think as Mr. Jaggers sort of outlined, the effect on shareholder value. We'd look at the key assumptions around revenue and costs and identification and quantification of the risks and mitigation strategies. We'd also look at the proposed funding or financing strategy that it was attached to it and the impact on the GBE's capital structure. And then, of course, the expected outcome and the overall impact on the company's position. So in considering, I think, additional investments as part of the corporate plan process, that they're sort of the broad principles that we would look to apply in assessing it.
We certainly wouldn't be in a position to identify potential investment opportunities that NBN and the NBN co-board might be considering at the moment for this corporate plan.
Okay, so for a strategic investment with a positive return, is this a return above 0%, above inflation, above an internal rate of return, commercial rate of return? What are we talking about here?
Well, the overall enterprise internal rate of return that's published in the corporate plan is currently 3.2%. So that would be a relevant sort of benchmark in considering, I think, the return that was associated with any new investment.
Okay, I have a topics on an additional topic. I'm just checking with the chair how we're going time-wise.
There's another 5 minutes, Mr. Watts, but there's 30 minutes allocated to the coalition. Ms. Davey and I don't have a significant number of questions, so we think there'll be balance as well. So how about you go for the next, till next 5 minutes, and then we'll give you the balance of the time at the end.
Thanks, Chair.
Maybe we could do it cleaner. If you go now,
Yeah, we'll go now then.
Look at this next topic.
All right.
Yep.
Ms. Senator Davey?
Thank you, Chair. I don't have many questions, but I am interested. I note that the New South Wales government is proceeding with a gig state project, and they have just closed tenders for the project, which is to connect fibre through some regional towns in New South Wales, namely Dubbo, Wagga, Parkes, and with a corridor to Cobar. Has the Department of Finance considered what this may mean for NBN and whether it is direct healthy competition or a risky competition that may undermine the investment that we've made in the NBN in those areas?
Thank you. I might see if Ms Hall is able to comment on that question.
Yes, certainly. So we understand, as you would, from the New South Wales Government recent announcements that the project is currently in an open tender, and as such, it's problematic for us to comment on that. It is possible, depending on the outcome of that tender, that gig state may operate in competition to the NPN, but it's too early to say, given the status of the tender arrangements, whether would be the case or not. It's really dependent on the outcome of that tender process.
And you may not be able to answer this, and I totally understand if you can't, but as it is an open tender process and NBN has experience in rolling out fibre networks, would it have, or was NBN able to put in for the tender or put in an expression of interest?
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that question again, please?
Well, my high-level understanding of the tender process, it's a two-stage process with expressions of interest as the first part, and then a request for tender process after that. But given the NBN's experience in rolling out and constructing fibre networks, is it plausible that the NBN could have, or maybe they did, lodge an EOI?
I don't think we have any information to that effect, and I don't think we're in a position to comment any further. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think we know if NBN was a participant in that, but it is a competitive process, so it may not be, if we did, and I don't think we do, be appropriate for us to talk about who's involved in a live sort of process. I do know that in New South Wales that for this gig state sort of project, that they are still in the kind of, they've gone to market, but they're still going to use their market information to kind of finalise the design in their two-stage kind of process that you alluded to. So it's probably a bit early to know exactly what that final design is going to look like to determine what the impact might be in terms of a competitive sense with NBN. But we're obviously interested in it, but we need to kind of see the outcome of that process before we have too sort of firm a view.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just move on quickly to the regional broadband scheme, which has now been put in place. Will that scheme, as it's currently established, be sufficient to enable the NBN to provide optimal services in rural and regional areas, noting that that scheme was put in place because it is recognised that the provision of broadband services in rural, regional and remote areas is not if it was a full cost recovery model, would not be commercially viable in those regions. So the regional broadband scheme has been brought into place to flatten, I suppose, and to cross-subsidise rural, regional and remote services. Is that scheme sufficient to provide the ongoing security that rural, regional and remote customers want for their services?
Well, that's quite a detailed question. I don't have the answer to that myself, but I'll just check with my team to see if any of us can help with that. But otherwise, I might need to take it on notice. I might just check with Mr. Atkin first.
I mean, Department of Infrastructure is responsible primarily for that piece of work, so I think we probably...
So we might need to consult with them and come back. We could certainly take it on notice and consult with our partner agency. I might just check if Ms Hall had anything before we formally do that.
No, I'm sorry. I don't have anything further on that. And yes, I think the Department of Infrastructure and Communications are probably going to be of most assistance, but we can take that on notice and come back to you to get an answer to that.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Okay, that's all from me. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Davey. I've got a question. In its statement of expectations, the government has stated that the NBN Co must operate on a full cost recovery basis. So in light of that, I wonder if you could comment on the proposition that is proffered by a number in this space that the government should write down the value of its investment in NBN. And secondly, what impact would you expect a write down to have on the pricing strategy?
I'll just ask Ms Carroll.
Yeah. So as I answered to a question a little earlier, that the value of NBN in government financial statements is in line with the Australian accounting standards, and so there isn't an ability for the government to unilaterally choose to write down or determine the value of NBN. So NBN at the moment, as we said, for the financial year most recently completed, is valued on the basis of the net assets, and there's a process being undertaken right now for the financial year that will end on 30 June 2020 to consider what's the appropriate value for the NBN that would be reflected in the first instance in the infrastructure financial statements and then rolled up into the consolidated financial statements. So, first part is there would not be an expectation that there would be a write-down of the value of NBN. The second part of that question being what would be the impact of that on the pricing strategy is that the value of the NBN in whole of government financial statements or in government financial statements would not naturally impact the pricing strategy for the NBN.
Ms Carroll, sorry, I wasn't suggesting, is it anticipated that there will be a write-down, but rather what comment does the department offer in relation to the proposition that is proffered by a number in this space that there should be a write-down in the value of the government's investment in the NBN?
Yeah. So the value of the government's investment in NBN reflected in financial statements is recorded at fair value. And so that fair value is determined in line with really strict requirements under Australian accounting standards. That value is audited on a number of occasions through the arrangement with the Australian National Audit Office. So as I said, that they're picked up, the NBN investment will be picked up in the first instance in the infrastructure financial statements, and then that's audited by the Australian National Audit Office, and then as that rolls up into whole of government statements, the consolidated financial statements are also audited by the Australian National Audit Office. So that would demonstrate that the value of NBN in financial statements is appropriately reflected at fair value, and on that basis it would indicate that there's no kind of basis for there being a write-down of the value.
So in more simple terms, can I just put a proposition to you and see if if it's acceptable. Those that propose that there should be a write-down in the value of the government's investment in the NBN fail to appreciate the operation of the relevant accounting standard.
So the value of NBN reflected absolutely has to be in line with accounting standards, and compliance with those accounting standards is assured through the role of the Australian National Audit Office. So yes.
Sorry, I cut over one of the witnesses, so I'll allow that person to continue.
Chair, could I just ask?
So, Chair, can I clarify who has been making these calls?
Look, I'm looking specifically at the material that there was a submission 18. I think it might help Mr. Watts.
Could I just further add to Ms. Carroll's testimony, just picking up on your question, Chair, in terms of the proposition that it might be suggested that the value of NBN should be written down. This is not a matter that is within the discretion of government or shareholders or the company. In fact, the value is determined in accordance with the accounting standards. It's not something that is subject to a discretionary decision.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. Thank you, Ms. Hall. That's very, very clear. I've concluded the questions I had. I think Ms. Senator Davey hers. I don't think. Do you have any, Dr. Allen? And if you don't, we can hand back to Ms. Templeman, who I think in turn is going to hand over to Mr. Watts, I think.
Chair, can I just clarify something? Can you?
Yep.
I'm still confused about who you were asserting is calling for the write-down.
So if I'm operating off, there's an example of at submission 18, page 1. It's also at submission 10, page 2. In any event, do we want to use the balance of the time?
Yeah, indeed. Well, it'd be good to get on the record which those submissions are and who's calling for that. I'm going to ask Mr. Watts to finish his questioning, and then I think Ms. Phillips might try and use whatever time's available.
In your hands till we end.
I
think we should go through. I think we should go through till about 10 minutes past.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I've only got half a dozen questions, 5 minutes or so. Mr. Jagger, can we just go back to the peak funding issue? I'd just like, can you confirm that NBN peak funding requirements, before they become cash flow positive, are now likely to exceed $51 billion as per the corporate plan definition, which already includes private debt in the peak funding at the expected $2 billion level?
All I can, I guess, reiterate is that the current corporate plan includes a peak funding number at $51 billion, and that the additional debt that was sought, certainly there's been a commitment to use $2 billion of that for completing the rollout in accordance with that corporate plan. And then any future decisions related to the current, the corporate plan under development to be released in August still matters to be considered by the NBN management and then board and shareholder ministers at some point. So there is no current plan that's been outlined that would see that number go above 51.
Okay, so can you rule out that peak funding will exceed 51 billion by the corporate plan's own definition? This has been the definition that's been in place for 8 years of corporate plans.
So I think that every corporate plan, the company, aided by the department and a range of advisors, tries to provide the best estimates that it can, and then it publishes those estimates. And so estimates change year to year, so I wouldn't rule any numbers in and out. I'd just say that the estimates are the best estimates that can be provided at the time, and the current corporate plan numbers are sort of clear, and the next corporate plan numbers, a range of factors will need to be considered in settling that corporate plan. So I wouldn't want to say at this stage exactly what that's going to look like because it's not yet settled.
Okay. Now, the NBN Co's working capital requirements, now, were they fully accounted for in the previous corporate plan? I can't see the $1.5 billion reservation for working capital in the last corporate plan.
I'm not aware that working capital requirements are explicitly outlined in the corporate plan. No.
I think we'll have to take that question on notice. I don't think we have that detail to hand today.
Okay. And how would NBN Co have managed working capital constraints that have been described without the additional debt facility?
We might just need to take that on notice. I'm sure we can provide you an answer to that. My understanding, and we'll check this on notice, is that NBN has always had some working capital arrangements that it's drawn upon from time to time. That's just how a business of that size and nature would usually operate. But we'll come back to you on the specifics of it. They wouldn't normally be outlined maybe in specific terms in the corporate plan, but there's certainly always been the need to manage the peaks and troughs in cash flow in the business. So there's always been that need to address those peaks, particularly at the time when, so those Telstra payments are sort of due. So we'll come back to you on that, just in terms of advice about how that's been managed in the past.
And there's one last question. Will NBN Co potentially use the additional debt facility to fund point-to-point enterprise fibre?
Well, certainly we wouldn't want to identify or talk about the range of investment ideas and options that are in front of NBN to consider. So I wouldn't really be able to rule any options in or out or discussion with NBN in or out at this stage.
I'll take it as a maybe. Thank you.
Ms. Phillips? I don't think we can hear you.
No, she's trying to find the mute button, I think. But unmute.
I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Any clues for her? I don't know if we've just lost her by mistake.
We've got a bit of time. I'd like to get her involved because she's been very patiently waiting.
Been very patient. She's still there, I gather. Okay. I might, while we're waiting to get her, I might just start questions on that section. I'm just trying to get some technical guidance. Is she actually still there?
She's not on the participation list, but perhaps, Madam Deputy Chair, if you were to ask some questions, use the time.
I will.
I'll put a text on the WhatsApp string for her.
Yeah, I will. Look, and one thing I'll just clarify. I've just looked at those two submissions, and so, in fact, the two submissions that were referred to in terms of those calling for a write-down, I think, Chair, you described it as people around this place, but in fact, the two people were...
no, sorry, I suggested people in this space. SPACE.
Then I misheard you, Chair. So
No, sorry. I was wondering why there was a rather strong response, and I was thinking, I just figured you immediately thought whenever I was saying something, it's always targeting the opposition, which I don't always.
Great, because it was the two submissions from external people, immediate, consulting and compete.
Yeah, and I used the word space in the sense of this policy area, if you like, or industry sector.
Very pleased to clarify that. All right, while we are waiting...
Put your guns down.
Yeah, I just like things to be clarified. So can I just clarify, so has the Department of Finance undertaken any market valuation of the Commonwealth's equity in the NBN in the past 12 months?
So the Department of Infrastructure is required to do valuations, but I'll ask Ms Carroll again.
Yeah, so Department of Finance for whole of government financial reporting, no, has not. We work with Department of Infrastructure in relation to that.
So it would have been done, and you can confirm it was done by the Department of Infrastructure?
So it will have been, so last year it was Department of Communications and the Arts, so NBN was within the Communication and the Arts portfolio. And so yes, as a natural part of financial statement preparation, then there is looking at all of the elements of the balance sheet, including the equity investment in NBN. And
okay, and Ms Phillips is back.
Can we hear you, Ms Phillips?
And all I've done...
I hope so. Sorry about that.
All I've done was ask if there's been any market valuation of the Commonwealth's equity done. So I'll let you pick up from there.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so I just got some questions in relation to dividends. So my first question is, can you confirm that in the current NBN corporate plan, NBN is projected to begin making dividend payments in 2032?
Is there a reference that you can point us to in the corporate plan that you're...
I don't have the reference right here.
Could I just clarify too, sorry, while that question in relation to dividends is being answered. In terms of evaluation of NBN, not necessarily a market valuation, it's what is the fair value of NBN to be recorded in financial statements.
We might come back to that when these questions are done then.
Okay.
So I think in the corporate plan, or certainly in the annual report from 2019, NBN sort of confirmed that no dividends have been paid or declared since the group was established. And I think in the in terms of looking forward, I might I just don't have that reference in front of me. I'm sorry,
okay.
Ms Phillips, but we'll just have to. Can probably come back to you on that fairly quickly on those.
All right. Well, my next question is, given NBN is forecast to be cash flow positive in 2023, I guess I'm just asking, why is it another 10 years until it is projected to pay a dividend?
Well, we might need to just come back to you on the explanation around the dividend policy, but certainly there's no expectation of a dividend being paid under the current corporate planning period, the 4 years of the corporate plan. In terms of the forward projection of dividends, that'll obviously be a matter that needs to be reviewed in every corporate plan. So there'll be an estimate at a point in time that will be reviewed. NBN will have substantial debt once it becomes cash flow positive, and certainly in its planning process would have envisaged paying down debt as a key priority. But I might take on notice the question about why there is that gap and come back to you, because as I said, I couldn't quite find that reference to when the dividends start being paid, and so I wouldn't mind just checking the facts and coming back to you with a comprehensive answer on that.
Okay. Well, this will probably might fall under that as well. My next question was this a decision of government or of NBN Co?
Certainly, the corporate plan is NBN Co's corporate plan. So they would be putting their forecasts and projections, but during the process of settling any corporate plan, there'd be discussions with agencies and then opportunity for ministers to seek any clarifications or questions. I would say that from our perspective, from a departmental perspective, dividends haven't really been front of mind, or the first, the next priority for the company, which is in its development stage and doesn't become cash flow positive for some years. So I think that there'll be certainly more serious discussions about dividend policy at the point in time when they become cash flow positive, complete the network, then become cash flow positive. And the key considerations for the company and then for us will be that balance between paying down debt, what the appropriate rate to do that is, and then return to government on its equity share. I'd also just say that we, in each corporate plan, we talk about the return to government on the equity investment. We still believe that the company estimate of its internal rate of return, which is around the 3.2% mark, will see the Commonwealth get a return on its investment over time. So we obviously keep a close eye on those IRR estimates, but in terms of when those returns come back, we could forecast now, but it's probably at the time when they're cash flow positive, there'll be more interaction on what the appropriate balance between paying down debt and return on equity is.
And if I could further assist the committee, other considerations that NBN Co would need to have regard to in relation to the payment of dividends also relate to when it earns accounting profits. So dividends, Corporations Act companies, generally speaking, can only pay dividends out of profits. And so whilst entities may be generating positive free cash flows from an accounting profit, net profit after tax perspective, I would expect that that's another factor that is driving the delayed payment of dividends to the Commonwealth as part of the return to the Commonwealth. But Mr. Jaggers is completely right in calling out that the return to taxpayers on the government's investment in NBN is a combination of both increase or change in the value of the entity and also payment of dividends and other returns to equity. But we'll provide further detail in relation to the dividend policy on notice to clarify.
Okay, I just had another question. So what will NBN be doing with its free cash flows beyond 2022?
Well, I think that realistically that'll all be outlined in corporate plans to come. So each 4 years we get a very good sort of picture. So each year we get a good picture of the next 4 years of expected capital spend, expenditure, revenue projections. And so I think that we wouldn't want to kind of outline sort of now, or wouldn't be able to outline now exactly what the corporate plan will look like in that year. What is it? It's at the end of that year.
So cash flows generally companies use to obviously service debt, and that will be a big drain on NBN's cash flow, particularly noting that refinancing or repayment of the Commonwealth loan is currently anticipated to occur by 30 June 2024. Also, as has been discussed through the course of these hearings, NBN Co will need to consider further investment in the network to maintain the value of the Commonwealth's investment in that, and then there's the returns to shareholders. So, generally cash is applied to those three kind of broad brush buckets after all operating expenditure is acquitted. But as Mr. Jaggers said, those are matters for future decisions in the context of upcoming corporate plan periods.
Okay, I just have one last question. If it has free cash flows and is not paying down principal on debt or dividends, what is the rationale for it taking on optionality for more debt?
Well, certainly the rationale for the establishing the $6.1 billion facility was to achieve a number of things. Firstly, it was obviously the completion of the network, the $2 billion required to complete the network as outlined in their last corporate plan. and then for consideration of to create some flexibility if the company decides to invest in additional areas. So I'm not sure that the fact that the timing of those free cash flows has impacts on the rationale for taking sort of the debt. Those free cash flows we know are coming. We know they'll be cash flow positive, but I think as Ms Hall said that cash flow positive and accounting net profit are two different sort of concepts. But we will. But I don't think that the rationale that NBN has used to go to the debt markets and to create that flexibility to draw down up to $6.1 billion is necessarily well, it's certainly not impacted by that future cash flow projection. That's always been sort of, I think the future cash flow, free cash flows predicted in this current corporate plan aren't too different from those of previous as adjustments each year, but I think that NBN's rate of return has been pretty stable. Expected rate of return has been pretty stable over the past 3 or 4 years, and that 3 to sort of 4% sort of range. So we're still expecting returns. The company will still have returns, so that its capacity to take on that additional debt, if there's a viable purpose for doing so, would be a matter for the board. But we don't necessarily see any problem with that.
Thanks, Ms Phillips. And Chair, I'm going to ask Senator Farrell on the phone to use up the remaining time that we have, if that's all right. Are you there, Senator? He's probably on mute. I know he's.
I can hear him.
Great.
I just have to get off mute and to where my questions are. All right, thank you, Susan. And I just have a few more questions on the NBN valuation methodology and timing. First question was, what potential impact will the additional $4 billion in debt have on the value of the Commonwealth equity?
So I don't know if my colleagues might have extra to add to this, but as a general principle, so I talked previously about there are two methods set out in accounting standards for the valuation of the NBN. So to the year ended 30 June 2019, it is valued on the basis of the net assets of the NBN. And so naturally, if liabilities grew, then that would reduce the value of the net assets. But there would be a whole range of things that would be taken into consideration, and lots of things will have changed over the last year. And then the second method of valuing the NBN, alternative method of valuing the NBN, is on a discounted cash flow basis, which looks at what are the future cash flows discounted to a present value. To date, NBN hasn't had sufficiently stable expectations in relation to future cash flows, and so it has been valued on that net assets basis. It likely at some point, and that is, as we said, something for infrastructure in the first instance to be working through with the Australian National Audit Office on a discounted cash flow basis. Because it's moved from net assets, the increase of additional liabilities may not have a similar impact in the valuation of NBN, if that makes sense.
Doesn't actually make that much sense. Would you mind expanding on that?
Perhaps if I could just...
yes, Ms Hall. Yeah.
Sorry, somebody else asking a question. Right?
Yes, so further to Ms Carroll's evidence, if NBN took on additional debt for the purposes of undertaking investment with a positive rate of return, then on a sort of first principles basis, you would expect that there would be a positive impact overall on the net value of the government's investment in NBN.
And is that what's happening here?
Well, there haven't been any decisions in relation to the use of additional debt.
Right. Okay.
If NBN took on additional debt for the purposes of paying down other debt, we would expect the effect to be neutral, which is swapping Commonwealth debt or private debt for other private debt. In the event that the valuation methodology that is used is the net assets basis, which is the current basis of valuation. Does that assist?
Yes. Why would you do that swap in debt? Are we talking lower interest rates? Is that the... Why do you swap the debt?
So the current Commonwealth loan that's been provided to NBN is a $19.5 billion loan. That loan has a maturity date or expiry date, for refinancing of June 2024. So when the government issued the loan to NBN, it was on the basis that NBN would swap out the public debt or the government debt for private debt by June 2024. The arrangements for that sort of swap out haven't been sort of settled. I mean, we do have a loan agreement with NBN that requires them to refinance in 2024, but we'll certainly be working with NBN on the timing and the refinancing plan for how it achieves that.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to run through some questions that took place during the NBN Joint Standing Committee back in June 2018 with Mr. Jaggers, who was then the attending Deputy Secretary of the Department of Finance. I'd like to take a minute to read his interaction with former Senator Ketter. What Mr. Jaggers said was that every year there's a valuation of NBN, which is a requirement for the accounts of the Department of Communications. So there is a valuation. It's not done on a discounted cash flow basis. It's on a net asset basis, and that's published each year in the department's annual report. Senator Ketter then said, "Did you say a valuation on net asset basis?" Mr. Jaggers said, "Yes, my understanding is that it's a fair value net assets valuation process, which conforms with accounting standard, and it's the normal practice of use of that methodology for a growing business where revenue streams are not 100% certain and set, as the company is in the growth rate. That's the usual basis for the valuation in this kind of period. When a company is more established, so having revenue streams that are well predictable over a number of years' past experience, then you might look to have a discounted cash flow methodology." Senator Ketter then says, "A discounted cash flow valuation method gives a better picture of the valuation of the enterprise, doesn't it?" Mr. Jaggers says, "That's some magpies sitting on my NBN, wanting to get in on the action, if you're wondering." Mr. Jaggers then says, "I think all of those valuation methodologies are appropriate in accordance with accounting standards. The one that is selected by the Department of Communications is the appropriate one and is in accordance with the accounting standards. The business, after it's completed, say, its rollout or its in-growth stage, might move to a discounted cash flow methodology at that point." So the question that relates to all of that is, what valuation method was used by the NBN in its most recent annual report, and what valuation methodology do you expect to be used in this year's report?
Well, certainly for last year's report, NBN has maintained the same basis for its valuation. I'll ask Ms Carroll if she wants to make further comment on that.
So there's actually a couple of layers in terms of the process with this. So NBN itself will produce its financial statements, and the NBN board would be responsible for ensuring that the assets and liabilities recorded on the NBN's balance sheet are appropriately recorded. And from that information, because NBN is an equity investment through, as we said, the Department of Communications last year, but moved into infrastructure through machinery of government changes this year, that communications and infrastructure for their financial statement preparation need to determine what is a fair value for the representation of the equity investment in NBN. There's a very rigorous process that's gone through to determine what's the appropriate methodology, and a rigorous process worked through by Communications and will be this year with Infrastructure, with the Australian National Audit Office to give assurance around that the methodology that has been selected is the most appropriate methodology, and that also then that the outcome of those calculations does appropriately represent fair value of NBN in the financial statements. And then the next layer of that, as I said, is that the communications last year and infrastructure statements this year will roll into consolidated financial statements, which again are audited by the Australian National Audit Office. So all three levels are audited. So the NBN financial statements to make sure that the base level representation of assets and liabilities is appropriate. Same for infrastructure, same for consolidated financial statements. It may well be, and it is a decision still to be taken, and it's very, very early days for infrastructure with their financial statements, that there may be a change in methodology, that it could be considered that net assets is no longer appropriate, and it may be appropriate to move to a discounted cash flow basis. But you should.
What would trigger that change?
So one of the primary reasons that have not been that Communications last year had not recorded it at a discounted cash flow. They've put a footnote in their financial statements actually that reference that, where they've talked about that at this stage the primary revenues are coming from, primary cash flows are coming from government, and so it's as they kind of move through their business life cycle, there's a change to the cash flow arrangements for the NBN. So it's primarily that. It's about having consistent, predictable future cash flows that would allow you to use that as a valuation methodology.
Senator Farrell, I'm just conscious we are now well over time.
Could I just ask one more? I'm sorry to keep doing this, Chair, but just one last question.
But that's fine. If it averts the need for questions on notice, then that'll be fine. Yep.
Okay. Look, in response to that last question, would you be able to give us an example of an investment NBN would make that generates a positive return?
Well, I think the return on the investment that the government's made in NBN, and in terms of the return to the company's corporate plans year on year have indicated a positive internal rate of return. So as a whole, the return for in the company and therefore and individual projects within the rollout are still indicating a positive return to government of around 3.2%. That's their IRR. So that's the internal rate of return to the company. So I couldn't, I wouldn't just call out specific investments, but as a whole, it's still predicted to make a return.
None spring to mind?
Oh, I didn't catch that, I'm sorry.
Does anything spring to mind that is an investment that does generate, a specific investment that does generate a positive return?
Well, all of the the company is currently in it's cash flow negative at the moment, so it's in a growth phase still. It does get to, as we discussed earlier, to positive cash flows in a period of time. But the return over all of the assets in the business in terms of their corporate plan calculation is that it's going to return 3.2% as a rate of return to the investments that they've made.
Okay, thank you. Chair, at this point
Excellent.
I'll have to leave the committee hearing.
Well, we're about to all leave. Senator Farrell, we're waiting for you to conclude. That concludes today's proceedings. Can I take this opportunity to thank officers from the Department of Finance? The committee has resolved that answers to questions on notice should be provided by the 24th of July 2020. I thank you again for your evidence. I also thank Hansard Broadcasting and the diligent staff at Secretariat for their assistance, as well as colleagues. I declare the hearing adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chair.